The Thames was black that September evening, and the air still carried the warmth of summer. A paddle steamer named the Princess Alice glided homeward toward London Bridge, her decks crowded with families returning from a day at Rosherville Gardens. Children slept against their mothers. A small band played a quiet waltz near the funnel. Coins clinked as fares were counted below deck. The river smelled of coal smoke and low tide, and the gas lamps of Woolwich flickered on the northern shore. Then, out of the dusk, a shape rose against the sky. The iron bow of a great collier, the Bywell Castle, cut the water without slowing. A woman pointed. A whistle screamed. The band stopped mid-note. And in the space of a single breath, the calm evening river opened its throat and began to swallow them whole. The quiet before the fall. Good evening, and welcome. This is the bedside historian, and the night has grown still. The lamps have burned low. The world outside your window has softened into a hush, and the hour has come to rest. Wherever you are listening from tonight, a quiet room in a great city, a small house at the edge of a sleeping town, or a place far from any road at all, you are welcome here. Perhaps it is very late on your side of the dark. Perhaps midnight has already passed, and the streets have gone silent. Perhaps it is only the edge of evening, and you are settling in for the long descent into sleep. Either way, the candle is lit. The chair is drawn close. There is nothing more to do tonight but listen. Before we begin, if this channel has ever brought you calm on a long night, please consider subscribing. A gentle tap of the like button, a quiet moment of your time, and it helps this small light burn a little longer. It helps others who cannot sleep find their way here too. Now, let us drift backward. Backward through the coal smoke and the gaslight. Backward through the crowded years of the last century. Backward to a river that once carried a whole city upon its back, and to a morning in September when 650 souls stepped aboard a small pleasure boat, thinking only of the day ahead. The date was the 3rd of September, in the year 1878. It was a Tuesday. London had woken warm, with a soft haze rising off the river and a light wind stirring the flags along the wharves. It was the last of the truly warm days of that year, though no one knew it yet. The great heat of August had eased. The summer holidays for the children of the middle sort were nearly over. Schools would open again the following week. Clerks would return to their desks. Servants would fold away the pale straw hats and bring out the darker wool. But on this one bright morning, before the return of duty and grey weather, many hundreds of families in London had planned a small treat. They had chosen to spend the day at Rosherville Gardens, the pleasure grounds down the river near Gravesend, where the roses were still in bloom and the lantern walks would glow after dark. To reach Rosherville, they had bought a ticket for the paddle steamer Princess Alice. She was moored that morning at Swan Pier, which stood on the north bank of the Thames just below London Bridge. The pier was a floating wooden platform, joined to the shore by a long ramp that rose and fell with the tide. Beyond it stretched the bridge itself, the wide new bridge of pale granite that had been finished only 16 years before. The monument to the Great Fire rose above the rooftops to the west, its gilded urn catching the first strong light of the sun. Below, at the pier, the Princess Alice waited with steam already up. She was a small vessel, as riverboats went, 219 feet from her sharp bow to her plain stern. Iron-hulled, painted dark below the rail and white above. 2 great paddle boxes stood on either side of her, each one carved with the letters of her name and the London Steamboat Company. A single tall funnel rose amidships, black with soot at the crown, and a light streamer of coal smoke lifted from it into the morning air. Her decks were of scrubbed pine. Her rails were painted white. Along her upper deck ran rows of wooden benches, and beneath the benches were folded oilcloth covers for use in bad weather. She had been built in Scotland 13 years before, at Greenock, by the yard of Caird and Company. She had first sailed under the name Bute on the waters of the Firth of Clyde. Then she had come south to the Thames, been given the new name Princess Alice, after the second daughter of Her Majesty the Queen, and had been fitted for the summer trade between London and the sea. She was not a grand ship. She carried no great cabins, no first-class saloon of dark wood and mirrors. She was a working boat, a shilling boat, a boat for men in serge suits and women in cotton prints, and children in short trousers and pinafores. Her fare that day was 2 shillings for the return journey. A ticket bought a place on the crowded deck, a small meal in the saloon below if a family had brought the extra coin, and a full day of the moving river. At the pier, from early in the morning, they began to come. The first travellers arrived just after 7, walking down from Cannon Street Station or Fenchurch Street with baskets in their hands. Fathers in dark suits and stiff round hats. Mothers in long skirts of navy or brown, with white blouses buttoned to the throat and small straw bonnets tied under the chin. Children ran ahead. Boys in sailor collars, with striped stockings and hard leather boots that clattered on the wooden ramp. Girls in white frocks, their hair braided with narrow ribbons. Babies rode in the crook of an arm, wrapped in shawls, though the day would be warm enough soon. Many of them lived in the crowded terraces of the East End and along the docks. Silvertown, Poplar, Bow. Some had come from further out, from Islington or from the workshops of Clerkenwell. There were bookbinders and printers among them. There were the wives of clerks who worked for the great shipping firms along the river. There were shopkeepers who had closed their doors for the day, and craftsmen who had asked their masters for the leave. There were children from the London Board School, in their Sunday best. A whole family from Bethnal Green had brought a little niece from the country to see the sights before she went home to Kent. A widowed mother had brought her 4 children to say farewell to a brother who would soon sail for Australia. He had come down from the North Country only that week to see them all one last time. Not all who boarded were poor. There were also men in tall silk hats, walking with sober wives on their arms. There were governesses and their charges. There was a party of Sunday school teachers from Wapping, carrying a hamper of cold pies and a stone bottle of ginger beer. A dressmaker from Holborn had come with 3 of her workroom girls, giving them the day for their good service through the long summer. An artist and his young wife had brought their painting things and a small folding stool, meaning to sit by the water near the gardens and sketch the boats as they passed. They filed down the ramp one after another. Each passenger paid the fare into a tin box, and each was given a small paper ticket in return. The tickets were pale blue for the return journey, printed with the name of the London Steamboat Company and the date. Some of these tickets would be found later in the pockets of the dead, soaked through and unreadable, and would be laid on tables in the dead house at Woolwich for the coroners to gather. The captain of the Princess Alice stood upon her small bridge, forward of the funnel. His name was William Robert Hollingsworth Grinstead. He was 47 years old. He had spent his whole working life upon the river, and he had held command of the Princess Alice for 4 seasons. He was, by every account, a careful and honest man. He wore the double-breasted coat of the company, with brass buttons and a peaked cap. His hair was greying at the temples. He had a wife and children of his own. He did not know that this would be his last day at his post. His chief mate stood below him upon the deck, calling gently to those still on the pier. There was a first engineer down in the engine room, watching the great single crank that turned the paddles. There were stokers below the waterline, feeding coal into the 2 boilers, their faces already blackened. There were stewards in white jackets in the small saloon, laying out plates for the day, and there were 3 musicians, hired for the excursion, tuning quietly near the funnel. A cornet, a violin, and a small accordion. They would play through the day, waltzes and polkas and a few slow airs, so that on the return home in the evening the children might dance a few steps on the crowded deck as the sun went down. By 7:30 the boat was already full below and beginning to fill above. The mate called for the last of the boarding. On the ramp there was still a small crowd. A young father, running late, arrived breathless with his little son upon his shoulders. A pair of sisters, one in dark blue and one in soft green, waved down a handsome cab and paid the driver from a small silk purse. An old man with a white beard shuffled slowly to the rail, helped by his grandson. All were taken aboard. No one was turned away. On these excursions the company preferred a full boat. Somewhere below decks, coins clinked and were dropped into leather bags. The stewards began to write down orders. ham and bread, cold tongue, a pot of tea for a shilling, ginger beer for the children, in small brown bottles with wire stoppers. Above, on the open deck, a young mother settled her 3 small daughters upon a bench. She unpinned her shawl and folded it beneath the youngest as a cushion. She had brought a little bag of boiled sweets, and she gave one to each child. The girls sat with their legs swinging, unable to reach the deck, and looked out at the water in wonder. Their names would be written into the records at Woolwich a few days later, but on this bright morning they were only 3 sisters in white frocks, tasting sugar. At last the whistle sounded. It was a deep, clear note, and it rolled over the river and up between the tall warehouses of the north bank. The mooring lines were cast off. The paddles began to turn. Slow at first, with a soft, heavy churn, and then faster, with a steady rhythm that would carry them all the long way down. The pier drifted backward. The great grey bulk of London Bridge slid overhead, and the Princess Alice passed beneath its arches and turned her bow to the east. The river opened before her. On the northern shore rose the Tower of London, dark and square, its old stone still holding the shadow of the night. Beyond the tower stood the low ranks of St. Catherine docks, where tall ships lay 2 and 3 abreast, their spars a bare forest against the sky. Then came the Pool of London, thick with barges and lighters and the working boats of the port. Watermen in flat caps pulled at long oars. Coal barges lay low in the water, black to their gunwales. From the wharves came the smell of tar and hemp, of coffee beans and hides, of raw sugar and salt fish. The Princess Alice threaded her way among them, her paddles turning slow, her whistle sounding at each bend. The band began to play. A soft waltz, a tune from the theatres of the West End that everyone knew that summer. A few couples stood and swayed a step or 2 upon the crowded deck. Children pressed to the rail. A little boy leaned so far over that his mother caught the back of his jacket and pulled him firmly to her side. On the south shore, the tall chimneys of the tanneries and the breweries of Bermondsey rose brown into the morning haze. The bells of a church rang 7 times, then 8. They passed under the shadow of the great warehouses at Wapping, and then out into a wider reach where the water grew clean and the wind freshened. They passed Rotherhithe, where the entrance to the Surrey docks lay beyond a wooden gate. They passed Limehouse, where the masts of the tea clippers stood tall in the basin. They passed the Isle of Dogs, low and green, with the tall cranes of the shipyards rising along its far side. And then the river swung south and the world grew wider still. The great dome of the Royal Naval Hospital at Greenwich came into view upon the southern bank, pale and beautiful in the strengthening sun. The children stood up on the benches to see it. The father in the tall silk hat lifted his little girl upon his shoulder and pointed out the twin colonnades and the green park rising behind. A retired sailor upon the deck, who had served in the last of the wooden ships of the line, took off his cap and stood a moment in silence as they passed the college. He had not seen it from the river for many years. Past Greenwich, the boat came out into the broad water of Blackwall Reach. Here the wind was stronger, and the smell of the sea began, faint at first, and then a little clearer as the tide ran down. On the north shore stood the works of the Thames Iron Works, where the great warships of the Royal Navy were then being built. The hammers of the yard rang across the water. Sparks rose from the forges. The great grey hull of a new ironclad lay in the ways, half finished, her rivets glinting in the sun. The passengers stared at her as they passed, and a small murmur ran along the deck. The Princess Alice steamed steadily on. Woolwich came into view, with its arsenal spreading along the river for a full mile. The long, low sheds, the tall chimneys, the stacks of cannonballs in the yards. On the pier at Woolwich, a small crowd waited for the boat, and she slowed to take them on. A few more families climbed aboard. The mate lifted a small child down over the gap. A boatman on the pier tossed up a rope. The whistle sounded once more. The paddles bit the water, and she pushed on into the wider reaches below the town. Below Woolwich, the river changed. The banks grew low and marshy. The great works fell behind. Cattle grazed upon flat meadows. The tall reeds bent under the wind. On the north side stood the outfall of the northern sewer at Barking, a low brick channel where the drains of half of London poured their waste into the tide. On the south side, at Crossness, stood the great pumping station of the southern outfall, with its tall Italian tower and its steam engines running day and night. Both outfalls emptied twice a day on the falling tide, so that their contents might be carried out to sea. On this bright morning the tide was still full, and the outfalls were quiet, and the water lay smooth and dark and gave no warning of what it held. The Princess Alice steamed on, past Erith, past the low green hills of Kent, past the church tower at Purfleet on the northern bank. The sun climbed higher. The morning haze burned away. The band played a slow polka. Children slept in the crooks of their mothers' arms. A ship's boy carried a tray of tea along the upper deck, moving carefully among the crowded feet. Somewhere below, in the small saloon, a young couple sat side by side and did not speak, but held one another's hands where no one could see. They had been married only that month. They had chosen this day for a small, quiet outing, to be together upon the water. Their names, too, would be written down at Woolwich. By 10 o'clock the Kentish shore rose fuller and greener, and the tall trees of Rosherville came into view, standing above the low chalk cliffs. The pier at the Gardens showed white against the water. The passengers began to gather their baskets and shawls. Fathers lifted small children onto their shoulders for a better view. Mothers straightened bonnets and smoothed skirts. The band played a bright march to bring them in. The whistle sounded, long and clear. The paddles slowed, and the Princess Alice, gentle and steady, drew in toward the pier, and the long summer day began. A day among the roses. The pier at Rosherville stood upon iron piles, and the boards of it were pale from long weather. The Princess Alice touched the piles with a soft nudge, and her mooring lines were made fast to the wooden bollards by two men in dark jerseys. The gangway was run out. The mate lifted his cap and called the passengers ashore, and one by one the 650 came down the plank in a slow, steady stream. Children first, hand in hand with mothers. Fathers behind, carrying baskets and folded shawls. The old man with the white beard was helped along by his grandson, and behind them came the newly married couple, close together but not touching, for they were shy in the crowd. Above the pier stood a wide flight of steps cut into the chalk cliff. At the top of the steps was the gate of the Gardens, an arch of iron painted white, with the words Rosherville Gardens set in a curve of pale letters across the top. A stout gatekeeper stood beneath the arch in a green coat and a hard round hat, and he took the sixpence of each visitor into a leather bag at his side. Some paid the sixpence separately from their steamer fare. Others held out a small coloured card that the London Steamboat Company had sold with the passage, and the gatekeeper waved them through with a nod. Children under 7 paid nothing at all. A painted board beside the gate carried the motto of the place in tall gold letters: "The place to spend a happy day." Many of the passengers read it aloud as they passed under the arch, and smiled, and did not think of it again. Beyond the gate the ground opened wide. The Gardens had been made 40 years before, out of an old chalk pit that had once given up its stone for the wharves and the houses of Gravesend. The pit was shaped like a great shallow bowl, and the sides of it rose in gentle terraces, and every terrace was thick with roses. Roses of white and of pale pink, roses of deep crimson, roses of soft yellow and of rich buttery gold. It was the first week of September, and many of the roses were past their best, but many others still bloomed strong and full, and the air in the low bowl of the Gardens carried their heavy scent up into the sun. Bees moved from bloom to bloom in slow, drunken paths. A gardener in a straw hat and a canvas apron pushed a small wooden barrow along a gravel path, gathering the fallen petals with a soft broom. At the centre of the bowl lay the Italian garden, laid out in neat squares and low box hedges, with a small fountain playing in the middle. The fountain was of pale stone, and it had 3 tiers, and the water fell from one tier to the next with a light chatter. Small goldfish moved beneath the surface, and children knelt at the low curb to look at them. A boy from Poplar, no more than 5 years old, dropped a boiled sweet into the water to see what the fish would do, and his mother pulled him gently back and made him sit upon the curb, until he promised to leave the fish in peace. Around the Italian garden ran the Grand Walk, a wide gravel path bordered by tall lime trees. Beneath the limes stood iron benches painted white, and on the benches sat older visitors, resting after the climb up from the pier. A grandmother in a black shawl unwrapped a small parcel of bread and cold bacon, and shared it with her son, and gave the crusts to a pigeon that came pecking at her boots. A retired seaman with a wooden leg tapped along the path and stopped to look at a bed of white asters. A little girl in a straw hat ran after a butterfly and lost it, and stood a moment blinking in the sun. To the west of the Grand Walk lay the archery lawn, a long strip of close-cut grass with straw targets at either end. There a party of young clerks from the city had taken up bows and were shooting for a small prize of $1 among themselves. Their coats were laid aside upon the grass. Their sleeves were rolled to the elbow. One of them, a thin young man with pale hair, had brought his sister, and she watched him with quiet pride from a bench beneath a tree. He would drown that night. She would live. Further along stood the maze, a low tangle of clipped yew hedges laid out in the old fashion, with a small pavilion at the centre where a bell hung from a chain. Children ran in among the hedges and were quickly lost, and their shouts rose over the walls in bright, thin peals. One father set his gold watch upon a bench and told his son that if the boy could reach the centre and ring the bell before 10 minutes had passed, he would earn a penny. The boy shot in among the hedges like a hare. The father sat down, folded his arms, and closed his eyes against the sun. At the eastern side of the gardens stood the bear pit, a deep round hollow lined with brick, and at the bottom of the hollow lived 2 brown bears brought years ago from the forests of the north. They were old bears now, and moved slowly, and slept most of the day upon a heap of straw. A small crowd gathered at the rail above and looked down. A boy in a sailor collar threw a piece of bread into the pit, and one of the bears rose upon his back legs to catch it. The children laughed and clapped. The keeper of the pit, an older man in a leather apron, watched with folded arms and said nothing. He had seen it 100,000 times. Near the bear pit stood the small aviary, a wooden cage 20 feet high, with pheasants and peacocks and a pair of macaws that had been brought years before from the West Indies. The macaws were named Jack and Bess. Jack could speak a few words in a low, croaking voice and would say "Good morning" to anyone who greeted him first. A little girl from Silvertown stood before the cage for a long time and greeted Jack over and over. The bird answered her only once, and she went away pleased and shy. At the highest terrace, set back against the wooded slope, stood the baronial hall. It was a long, low building of pale brick with mock battlements upon the roof, and inside it were laid out the tables for the great meal of the day. Cold meats, boiled ham, cold beef and pickles, bread cut thick and buttered, small pastries of jam, pots of tea kept warm upon iron trivets, bottles of ginger beer and lemonade cooled in tin pails. A meal in the baronial hall cost $1 for a grown person and 6p for a child. Many of the excursionists brought their own baskets and did not eat at the tables at all, but spread cloths upon the grass in the shade of the trees. Others gathered at the hall in family parties and sat at the long benches, and the room was soon full of the low, steady sound of many voices talking together. Between the courses, the band that had come down upon the Princess Alice played from the open stand near the fountain. The cornet led, high and clear. The violin followed. The small accordion held the bass. They played the tunes of the season, waltzes and polkas, and a few gentle marches, and now and then they stopped and drank cold water from a jug that the gardener brought them. When they played, some of the young men and women drifted down onto the dancing platform, which lay upon the far side of the fountain, and they danced a step or two upon the wide boards. The dancing platform was made of oak, and had been laid down 20 years before, and the surface of it was worn smooth as glass by many years of soft-soled shoes. Not everyone danced. Many of the older visitors sat upon the terraces and looked out over the river below. From the upper terrace one could see the Thames spread wide and shining, with the tall ships passing up and down under sail, and the paddle steamers threading among them. One could see the smoke of the chimneys of Gravesend, and beyond that the low green hills of Kent, and further off the pale rise of the North Downs. On this clear September day it was possible to see for many miles. An artist in a soft brown suit had set up a small folding stool upon the upper terrace, and he sketched the river in a small book with a stub of pencil. His young wife sat beside him with a novel, but she did not read. She only watched his hand move across the paper. The Sunday school teachers from Wapping had come with 20 children of their school. The children had been washed for the day, and their hair combed and their boots polished. They sat in 2 long rows upon the grass beneath a great chestnut tree, and the teachers passed among them with slices of bread and jam and small mugs of milk. When the meal was done, the head teacher, a thin, serious woman of about 40, gave each child a small paper of humbugs, and they were allowed to run in the maze until 3 o'clock, and then to gather again by the fountain. Some of these children would not sit at their school desks again. Their empty places would be marked on Monday morning with small folded cards. The dressmaker from Holborn had brought her 3 workroom girls, as she had promised, and she took them first to the flower beds, then to the aviary to see the peacocks, and at last to the small stall near the hall, where a woman sold pink and white sugared almonds in paper cones. She bought each girl a cone, and they walked along the grand walk together, eating slowly, laughing at nothing in particular, as young women do when they are given a free day in the sun. Their names were Emily, Sarah, and Jane. Only Sarah would come home. The newly married couple wandered alone. They spoke little. They did not need to. They walked to the far end of the gardens, where the paths climbed among the trees, and they sat upon a bench beneath an old cedar and looked down at the river. The young husband held his wife's hand and did not care who saw. He was a printer's clerk in the city. She was the daughter of a shopkeeper in Hackney. They had known each other since they were 12 years old. They had married on the 14th of August, only 20 days before. He would be pulled from the water that night. She would not. In the afternoon, as the sun crossed toward the west, a light breeze rose from the river, and the flags upon the gate poles lifted and snapped. The children who had run in the maze came out flushed and tired, and lay upon the grass, and were fed the last of the ginger beer. Mothers packed away the crusts and the empty tins. Fathers folded the cloths. Baskets were tied up again with string. In the theatre, which stood at the low side of the gardens, a short comic play had been given at 3, and now the small audience came out into the light, blinking. A juggler performed upon the terrace for a little crowd, and passed a battered hat afterward, and thanked those who dropped in a penny. Somewhere between 4 and 5, a whisper began to move among the visitors that the return boat would be called at 7, or a little earlier if the tide required, and that the Princess Alice would take her passengers home under the last light of the day. Those who had bought return tickets began to think of gathering. Those who had wandered far in the upper walks began to make their slow way back toward the terraces above the pier. Children were counted and counted again. A mother from Bow discovered that her 3rd little girl had wandered off, and searched for her in a small panic among the rose beds, and found her at last asleep beneath a bench, with a boiled sweet still held in her closed hand. The band played a soft, slow air upon the stand, and the sun began to lower into the west, and the light on the river turned the colour of pale honey. The tall chalk cliff behind the gardens threw a long shadow across the water. The masts of the ships in the reach caught the last of the gold. Down at the pier, the men in dark jerseys walked out again along the boards and made ready for the reboarding, and a small dog followed at their heels, wagging his tail. Above them, at the arch of the gate, the gatekeeper in the green coat lit the 2 lanterns that were hung there for the evening, though it was not yet dark. The lanterns swayed a little in the freshening breeze. The old grandmother in the black shawl folded up her parcel of bread and began the slow walk down toward the steps. The clerks packed away their bows and their targets. The father with the gold watch called his son from the maze and paid him the penny, for the boy had rung the bell in 8 minutes. The children of the Wapping school were gathered by their teachers into 2 neat rows. The dressmaker took her 3 girls by the shoulders and turned them toward the pier. The young married couple rose from their bench beneath the cedar, and the husband placed his wife's shawl gently over her shoulders, for the air was beginning to cool. The bell of the pier rang once, and then twice, and then a 3rd time, long and slow, and its sound rolled up through the terraces and among the roses and up to the highest walks. It was the call to board. Slowly, family by family, the 650 came down the gravel paths in the golden light of the ending afternoon. They passed under the white arch of the gate a second time. They read the motto once more, and some of them smiled. Below them, the Princess Alice waited at her piles, with steam already rising quietly from her tall funnel, and the water of the Thames lay smooth and empty and dark beneath her paddles, waiting for the tide to turn. The Homeward Tide. The bell of the pier rang once more, softer this time, and the last of the returning excursionists stepped down the plank onto the deck of the Princess Alice. It was a little after 6 in the evening. The sun stood low above the trees on the north bank, and the light upon the water had turned the colour of old brass. A light wind moved along the reach, cool at last after the long warm day, and it carried the smell of the tide and of coal smoke from the little town further down the shore. The mate stood at the head of the plank and counted the passengers as they came aboard, marking each family with a small nod. He did not use a book. He kept the count in his head, as he had done every day of that season. He knew the ways of a full boat, and he knew when she was near her limit. The Princess Alice was licensed to carry 936 souls upon these home waters, and by the mate's reckoning she was not yet full, though she was crowded. There would be room, he thought, for those still waiting at the pier at Gravesend a little further down the reach. The stewards below had cleared away the plates of the noon meal, and had begun to lay out cold suppers for those who wished to buy one on the way home. Bread and cheese, cold ham, a small pie of veal, a bottle of stout for a few pence, a pot of tea for a shilling. The saloon smelled of tea leaves and of pipe smoke, for the men were already lighting their clays and their small brown briars. Above, upon the open deck, the 3 musicians took up their places once more near the funnel. The cornet drew a long, low note. The violin answered. A small accordion sighed. They played a slow evening tune, a piece from the old country songs that many upon the deck knew from their childhood. The mooring lines were cast off. The paddles began to turn. The pier drifted backward. The white arch of the gardens stood high upon the cliff, still gilded by the last light. The 2 lanterns at the gate glowed softly against the shadow. A few visitors who had missed the boat stood upon the pier and waved, and the passengers waved back, and the small dog barked once at the water and was gone. The Princess Alice slid out into the reach, and her bow came slowly round toward the west. The paddles found their old steady rhythm. The tide was still on the ebb, running down toward the sea, and the boat pushed against it. She would have to work a little harder on the homeward run than she had on the way down. This was the way of the river. Every waterman upon the Thames knew it. The evening boats always fought the falling tide. She steamed the short distance up to Gravesend Town Pier, which lay only a mile further up the shore. The town rose above the pier in a soft brown cluster of roofs and chimneys, and the tall spire of St. George's Church stood pale against the sky. On the pier a crowd of about 100 more waited for her, families who had come down to Gravesend for the day upon other boats, or who had spent the afternoon in the little tea-rooms and pleasure walks of the town itself. There were also a few men in dark suits with small carpet-bags in their hands, clerks who had been sent down on business and were now returning to London. The mate lowered the plank once more. The passengers came aboard, one after another, and the mate counted still. A few families who had grown tired of waiting had gone to the railway station instead and would take the train home. Others pushed forward with cheerful haste, glad to be given a place at last. A young woman in a grey travelling dress led an old woman by the arm. A father in a straw hat carried a sleeping child upon his shoulder. A pair of soldiers of the line, in scarlet coats and pillbox caps, came aboard on their evening leave and stood together at the rail, looking out at the water. By the time the Princess Alice pulled away from Gravesend, the low sun had dipped behind the trees on the Essex shore, and the light was beginning to fail. The sky above was still pale blue, but the water had turned a deeper grey, and the far banks had lost their colour. The lamps of the town came on one by one behind her, small orange points along the shore. Somewhere in the streets a church bell rang 7 times, and the sound floated out across the water and was gone. The boat settled into her long, slow run for home. The paddles beat steady. The engine below thumped its calm, heavy pulse. The stokers fed the boilers and wiped their black faces with rags. In the wheelhouse, Captain Grinstead stood at his post, his hands upon the spokes, his eyes upon the reach ahead. Beside him stood the helmsman, a stout man named John Ayres, and a little way behind, upon the deck outside, the mate walked slowly among the passengers with a lantern already lit in his hand, though the dark had not yet come. Upon the deck the mood was easy and quiet. The great excitement of the day was over. The children were tired. Many had been given a little supper of bread and cold meat from a mother's basket, and now sat leaning against a father's coat, or lying with their heads in a mother's lap. The 3 sisters in white frocks from the morning were curled together on a bench near the funnel, all 3 asleep, their small boots dangling above the deck. Their mother sat beside them with a shawl over her knees, and looked out at the dimming shore and did not speak. She was thinking of the tea she would make when she reached home, and of the beds she would turn down for the girls, and of the letter she must write to her sister in the country the next day. She would do none of these things. The newly married couple stood together at the port rail near the stern. The husband had his arm about his wife's shoulders. She leaned her head against him, only lightly, only so that a passer-by might think she was only tired. They watched the wake of the boat spread away behind them, silver in the fading light. They spoke of a small house they hoped to take in the coming year, a house in Dalston, 2 rooms above a stationer's shop. They spoke of the child they hoped to have. The husband laughed softly at something his wife whispered to him, and he kissed the top of her head, and the wind lifted a loose strand of her brown hair. The Sunday school teachers from Wapping had settled their 20 children upon the benches near the bow. The children were quiet now, worn out by the long day among the roses. The head teacher, the thin, serious woman of 40, walked among them and drew a light shawl over the smallest ones, and lifted a boy who had slipped down into the gangway back onto the bench. She had been up since 5 that morning. She was tired herself. She thought of the letters she must write on Monday to the parents of certain children whose fees had fallen behind, and she thought of the coal she must order for the schoolroom before the winter came. She did not think of danger. There was no reason to think of it. The dressmaker from Holborn sat with her 3 girls upon a bench beneath the port paddle box. Emily leaned against her shoulder. Sarah sat upright, watching the passing shore. Jane had wrapped herself in a green woolen shawl and was already half asleep. The dressmaker herself was a widow of about 45, and she had brought these girls up as if they were her own. She thought, as she sat there in the growing dusk, that she had spent a shilling on the sugared almonds and 6pence on the meal in the hall, and she thought that it had been worth every coin, for the girls had laughed all day, and had looked upon the roses, and had ridden upon the Thames. She would remember, before the end, that she had given them a happy day. The Princess Alice passed the low mouth of the Medway on the southern side, and then the wide flat shore of Grays on the northern side. On the water there was little other traffic. A few sailing barges lay at anchor with their tan sails lowered. A small tug pulled a string of coal-lighters up the reach, her funnel sending out a fat plume of dirty smoke that drifted away eastward on the wind. A rowing boat, with 2 watermen aboard, crossed the reach in front of the Princess Alice at a safe distance, and the men lifted their caps as she passed. The captain acknowledged them from the wheelhouse with a small movement of his head. The sun set fully behind the woods above Purfleet, and for a little while the whole reach lay in a soft grey twilight. It was that hour on the river when the boundary between water and sky grows thin, when the far banks lose their edges and become only long dark ridges, and when the passing lights upon the shore begin to matter. The lamps of the arsenal at Purfleet came on. The lantern on the barge-master's cabin at a distant anchorage was lit. The Princess Alice hung out her own lights now, the red port lantern and the green starboard lantern low upon the rails, and a small white mast light above. Below Erith the river bent north, and the Princess Alice came round with it, and the wind fell a little as she turned. The water in the bend lay flat and dark. The paddles beat softly. The engine kept its old slow pulse. Somewhere below decks a steward called an order to the galley. Somewhere upon the deck a child cried for a moment and was hushed. The band had put down their instruments now, for the light was too dim for the players to read their music, and the older passengers had begun to drift into quiet talk or into silence. The captain in the wheelhouse spoke a few words to his helmsman. He gave the course for the long reach ahead. He knew this water as he knew his own hand. He had been up and down it 2,000 times. He knew every buoy, every mud bank, every wharf, every point of light. He knew the way of the tides. He knew that the ebb was strong this evening, and that the water below Woolwich would run against them harder than it had all day. He was not afraid of it. He had brought his boat home safely on every night of every season. He thought, if he thought at all in that moment, only of his supper and of his wife and of the small house at Woolwich where his own children were even now waiting for him to come home. The old grandmother in the black shawl sat on a bench near the funnel with her son beside her. She had eaten a little of the bread and bacon she had saved from the noon meal, and had drunk a cup of hot tea that her son had bought her at the saloon. She was warm enough. She was tired but content. She had spent the day among her family. She had seen the roses. She had heard the band. She had walked upon the terraces above the great river. It was, she thought, the best day she had had in many years. She closed her eyes for a moment and let the paddles beat softly beneath her. The Princess Alice steamed on, past the low pale walls of the powder magazines at Purfleet, past the wide mud flats of Rainham on the northern side, past the small church of Erith on the southern side, which stood back from the river among old trees. The wind rose again for a moment, and then dropped, and then settled into a steady light breeze from the west. The stars had not yet come, for the sky was not yet fully dark, but the first faint point of a great planet burned low above the roofs of the little town at Erith, and one of the soldiers at the rail lifted his hand and pointed it out to his companion. Ahead of the Princess Alice, though she could not yet see it, the river ran on into a long, slow bend. The bend was called Galleon's Reach. It swept from the south round to the west, and at its lower end stood a low point of land upon the southern side. The point was called Tripcock Point, or sometimes Crossness Point, and it was known to every waterman on the river as a place where boats must give one another a wide berth, for the channel there was narrow, and the current in the bend ran hard on the ebb, and vessels coming down often did not see vessels going up until they were close upon them. Beyond that point, though the Princess Alice did not know it, and though her captain did not know it, and though no soul upon her decks had any thought of it, a great black shape was even now moving out from the wharves at Millwall further up the river. She was a screw collier of the North Country trade, iron-built, deep laden with a load of coal for the port of Newcastle, and her name was the Bywell Castle. She had swung slowly out into the reach as the last of the day drained from the sky. She had turned her bow east. Her lights had been hung, her wheel had been given to her pilot, and she had begun her long, slow run down the river toward the sea. The Princess Alice steamed on into the growing dark. Her paddles beat steady. Her passengers spoke softly, or slept, or looked out at the passing lights of the shore. The tide ran against her. The band was silent. The captain watched the reach ahead, and above the low bend of galleons, the first hard stars of the evening began, one by one, to appear. The iron in the dusk. Upstream of the reach where the Princess Alice moved so quietly toward home, the river ran between banks of black mud and low warehouses, and here the day did not end so softly. At Millwall, on the western side of the Isle of Dogs, the dry dock of the Millwall ironworks still hissed with the small last work of the afternoon. The tall gates of the dock stood open to the tide, and inside them, held straight upon her keel blocks until only an hour before, lay a screw collier of the North Country trade. Her name was the Bywell Castle. She had come down into the Thames a fortnight earlier from her home port on the Tyne, and she had been laid up in this dry dock for the painting of her hull. The work was now done. Her plates had been scraped clean of salt and rust. Her seams had been red-leaded. Her long sides had been given 2 coats of a hard black paint that was still not fully dry, and it shone in the fading light with a wet gleam like new coal. She was a great vessel by the measure of the river, 254 feet from stem to stern, iron built throughout, 890 tons by her old register, though those who knew her better would say she carried a good deal more than that when she was laden with coal for the Egyptian trade. She had a single tall funnel amidships, painted black with a broad white band beneath the crown. She had 2 masts, a foremast and a mainmast, both of them stripped now to the topmast, for she was in port and did not need her sails. She had no paddles. The Bywell Castle was a screw ship, driven by a single great propeller that turned deep beneath her stern, and her engine, a compound steam engine of the modern kind, lay low in her belly and could push her long hull through the water at a steady 9 knots, even against a hard tide. She belonged to a firm at Newcastle upon Tyne, the shipping house of Messrs. Hall Brothers, which owned a small fleet of colliers in the coasting trade and in the long run down to the Mediterranean. She had come south in ballast at the beginning of the month. She had entered the dry dock at Millwall on the 5th day. Her painting had taken 16 days, and it had been done well, for the Hall brothers were careful men and did not spare the shilling upon their ships. Now, on the evening of the 3rd of September, in the year 1878, she was ready for the sea again. Her orders were to leave the dry dock upon the falling tide, to take on the last of her provisions and her water at a coal wharf a little further down the reach, and then to make her way through the night down the Thames and out to the German Ocean, and so northward around the coast to the Tyne, where she would load a full cargo of coal for the port of Alexandria in Egypt. Her master that day was a north country man of about 40, whose name was Thomas Harrison. He was a stout, plain man in a dark blue coat and a peaked cap, and he had come south with the ship for the painting. He knew his vessel well. He knew her ways in a seaway, and he knew the trim she needed when she was laden, and he knew the small habits of her engine and her steering gear. But he did not know the Thames. He had come down it only twice before, and always in company with a pilot, and the running of the river was not, in his own honest reckoning, a thing he had by heart. So it was that upon this evening, as upon every voyage on this reach, he had put himself and his ship into the hands of a licensed river pilot. The pilot's name was Christopher Dix. He was an older man, perhaps 50, with a grey moustache and a long grey coat, and he had brought many hundreds of ships up and down the Thames in his time. He held the certificate of the Trinity House. He knew the river as well as any man alive. Around 4 in the afternoon, the great gates of the dry dock had been eased open, and the tide had crept in about the Bywell Castle's hull, and by 6 she was afloat once more upon her own keel. Small tugs had been made fast to her bow and to her stern. Their little funnels blew short black gusts against the sky. Their bells rang out, and the men upon the wharf answered with the shouts of the trade. Slowly, very slowly, the Bywell Castle was drawn out of her dock and into the reach of the river beyond. The tugs turned her head downstream. Her long black side swung out into the current. The men upon the shore watched her go with the small, quiet pride of workmen who have finished a good piece of work. One of them, an older painter with a smear of red lead upon his cheek, took off his cap as she passed and said, half to himself, that she looked as smart as any ship upon the river that day. Once she was clear of the dock, the tugs were cast off. The engine of the Bywell Castle turned over with a low, deep note, and the great single screw began to bite the water. She moved forward under her own power, slow and heavy, the way a large, empty ship moves when she has yet to take on her cargo. She was in ballast still. Her holds were dry. Her draught was light, and her sides stood high above the water, and her bows lifted a little as she pushed against the wind. The freshening breeze from the west caught her upper works and pushed her hull a small degree to the east, and her helmsman corrected for it with a small, easy turn of the wheel. On her bridge stood Captain Harrison at the port rail, and Pilot Dix in the middle, and the helmsman, a young man of 26 named Henry Hardy, at the wheel. The night orders had already been given below. The engineers had taken their posts. The stokers had begun to feed the boilers for the long run down the river. Below her bridge, along the length of her long dark deck, a small crew of the coasting trade went about the last of their preparations. Ropes were coiled, hatches were dogged. The two masts stood bare against the sky. On her foredeck, a small dog belonging to the second mate came out from the crew's quarters, sniffed at the wet paint, and lay down beside the anchor windlass in a patch of the last sun. The second mate came out a moment later and rubbed the dog's ears and walked forward to check that the anchor chains were properly stowed. He did not think of danger. There was no reason to think of it. He was thinking of a letter he must write to his mother when they reached Newcastle, and of a small parcel he had bought for her that morning in Poplar, and of the beer he would drink at the Sun Inn on the quayside when they were paid off after the Egyptian voyage. At the wharves along Millwall, the men worked on. Iron struck iron in the shipyards. A small crane whined as it lifted a bale of rope onto the deck of a barge. A tug blew a short salute upon her whistle as she passed the Bywell Castle. The old iron ships lay at their moorings in long dark rows, and here and there a lamp had already been lit upon a barge-master's cabin, and the little points of orange light hung upon the water like fireflies at the edge of a great pond. The sky above the reach had turned to the pale grey of a mackerel's back, and the first faint stars had appeared over the eastern shore, where the marshes stretched out flat and low and dark toward the sea. The Bywell Castle moved slowly down the reach. Her pilot spoke a few quiet words to her captain about the state of the tide. The ebb was still running strong. It would carry them down at a good pace, but it would also make the corners of the river run harder, and the pilot said that they must keep a careful watch about them, for the evening boats would be coming up from Gravesend and Woolwich under the last light of the day. The captain nodded. He gave the order for the port and starboard lights to be lit, and for the white masthead lantern to be hoisted, and this was done by a young seaman named Purcell, who climbed a short way up the foremast and set the light in its bracket, and came down again wiping his hands upon a rag. She passed the entrance to the West India docks upon her starboard side. A great sailing ship, three-masted and painted white above her copper, lay at anchor there with her yards squared. Her name was upon her stern in tall gold letters, though the light was already too poor for those upon the Bywell Castle to read it. 2 lamps burned upon her bulwarks. A small boat pulled slowly from her side toward the shore. The Bywell Castle passed her at a distance of perhaps 40 yards, and the pilot lifted his hand in the old greeting of the river, and someone on the other ship raised a lantern in reply. Downstream came the great dome of the Naval Hospital at Greenwich upon the southern shore, its pale walls now grey against the darkening sky, its long colonnades holding the last light like an old scroll. The Bywell Castle passed it slow and steady, and her captain, a North Country man who had rarely come so far up the Thames, looked upon it with a small, quiet awe. It was the finest building he had ever seen upon a river. He remarked as much to his pilot. The pilot only smiled and said that the Greenwich pensioners took their tea in that great colonnade at 4:30 each afternoon, and had done so for 100 years, and that the tea was very good and very hot and cost them nothing. The captain smiled at that, and the 2 men said no more for a little while, and the Bywell Castle steamed on down the reach. She passed the low green Isle of Dogs upon her port side, and the tall cranes of the Blackwall shipyards where the great warships of the Royal Navy were built. A single hammer still rang from a forge in the works. A spark rose against the sky and died. On the southern shore, at Greenwich Reach, the small piers of the ferrymen were lit with their solitary lanterns, and a few late passengers were being taken across the dark water in rowing boats. The Bywell Castle moved through this small night traffic with the slow, easy caution of a large vessel in a narrow reach. She did not hurry. She had a long night before her, and there was no need to press. At Blackwall Point, her pilot ordered a slight change of course, for the reach turned there, and the channel ran close to the northern shore. The wheelman answered with a small turn of the wheel. The great screw beat the water at her stern. The engine below sent up its steady, dull thud. And ahead, though the last of the daylight was almost gone, the pilot could still see the wide sweep of the reach that led toward Galleons and Woolwich beyond, where the small orange lamps of the arsenal had begun to appear across the water. Somewhere down that long reach, at a distance which the pilot judged to be about 3 miles, another set of lights was moving on the water. He saw them first as a faint white glow, and then, after another minute, as a small white masthead lantern above a low red port light and a low green starboard light. It was a steamer, and she was coming up the river against the ebb, and by the pace of her lights she was making good speed, and by the pitch of her masthead lantern she was one of the small pleasure boats of the London trade, not a heavy sea steamer. The pilot watched her for a long moment without speaking. He named her, in his own mind, without certainty, as one of the return boats from Gravesend. He said nothing to his captain yet, for there was as yet no need. The two vessels had a full stretch of open water between them. The reach was wide. The channel was clear. The night was young. The Bywell Castle held her course. Her paint was still soft along her side. Her small dog slept upon the foredeck beside the windlass. Her second mate stood at the port rail smoking a short pipe. Her captain and her pilot stood together upon the bridge and watched the far white light moving slowly against the ebb, and neither of them spoke, though each of them had begun, very quietly, in the private way of men who have long worked upon the water, to think about which side of the river he would give to the other, when at last the moment came. The wind rose a little. The stars grew clearer. The last light on the water thinned into a thread of copper along the northern shore, and then even that was gone, and the reach lay open and dark ahead. And down that long dark reach, from opposite ends, and each unknowing, the two vessels moved slowly, steadily, patiently, toward the low shadow of a small point of land upon the southern side, called by the watermen Tripcock Point, and beyond it the narrower waters of Galleon's Reach. The whistle that came too late. The wind fell away as the Princess Alice came round the long, slow bend below Erith, and for a little while the water lay flat and dark as poured pitch beneath her paddles. The last thread of copper light had gone from the northern shore. The stars had come out one by one above the marshes, small and hard and cold. On the deck the passengers spoke in low voices, or did not speak at all. A child murmured in his sleep against his mother's arm. The three musicians had put their instruments away in their soft cloth bags and sat quietly upon a bench near the funnel, their day's work almost done. The two lanterns upon the boat, the red at the port rail and the green at the starboard, threw small pools of coloured light upon the wet deck, and the white masthead lamp above the funnel burned steady and clear. In the wheelhouse Captain Grinstead stood with one hand upon the polished rail and the other in the pocket of his dark coat. Beside him at the wheel stood John Ayres, the helmsman, a stout, patient man who had worked the Thames boats for 20 years. Neither man spoke. There was no need. The reach ahead was familiar water. The tide was strong on the ebb, and the boat pushed against it steadily, and the paddles beat their old slow pulse. In the small clock upon the wheelhouse wall it was nearly 7:45 in the evening. In another 40 minutes, the captain thought, they would be tied up again at Swan Pier below London Bridge, and the passengers would step down the plank into the gaslight of the city, and the boat would be washed down for the night. Ahead of the Princess Alice the river bent to the north, and the low point of Tripcock came slowly out of the shadow on the southern side. It was a flat piece of marshy ground, thick with reeds, with a small white beacon upon a post at its farthest edge. Beyond it the reach opened again into the wide dark stretch that the watermen called Galleons, a mile of black water bordered on the north by the arsenal sheds of Woolwich, and on the south by the low fields of Plumstead. The lamps of the arsenal glowed faintly across the reach, small orange points strung out in a long line. On the water there were no other lights save one, and that light was some way upstream near the middle of the reach, and it was moving slowly toward them against the ebb. Captain Grinstead had seen the light some minutes before. He watched it now without haste. It showed as a small white masthead lantern high above the water, and below it he could make out the low red gleam of a port light. A green starboard light showed too, though only faintly. By the height of the masthead lamp and by the way the vessel came on, he knew her at once for a large steamer, deeper laden than his own boat, and coming down the river toward the sea. A collier, most likely, or a coasting cargo boat outward bound. She was still perhaps half a mile off. There was time enough. The rule upon the river was old and known to every man who worked it. Steamers meeting head to head were each to give way to starboard, so that each boat passed the other on the port side, port to port, in the way of ships upon the open sea. It was the rule of the Trinity House. It was the rule of the Board of Trade. It was the rule that Captain Grinstead had followed on every night of every season for the last 20 years, and it was the rule that Pilot Dix upon the bridge of the Bywell Castle had followed for even longer than that. There should have been no confusion. On any ordinary evening there would have been none. But this evening the tide was running very hard down toward the sea, and the current in Galleon's Reach was strong along the middle of the channel, and there was in that stretch of the river a small local habit among the upgoing boats that was not written in any rule book. The captains of the pleasure steamers, who knew every yard of the water, had long been in the way of hugging the southern shore on the flood of the tide, so as to catch the slower water near the point of Tripcock and to save a little of their coal. It was a small saving, but it was worth having, and it was done every day. Captain Grinstead had done it 1,000 times. He gave the order now, quietly, without ceremony. Starboard the helm. John Ayres put the wheel down a small amount. The bow of the Princess Alice began to swing very slowly toward the southern shore. It was not a sharp turn. It was only a gentle correction to bring her nearer the marshes, so that she might pass under the shadow of Tripcock Point and take advantage of the softer current in the lee of the land. The paddles beat on. The engine below thumped its calm, heavy pulse. The captain looked forward again at the light of the vessel coming down. In the dark it was hard to judge distance, but he thought there was still a good half-mile between them, perhaps a little more, and by the way his own boat was drawing across the reach he would pass this stranger comfortably upon the starboard side, that is, upon his own right hand. Upon the bridge of the Bywell Castle, at that same moment, the pilot Christopher Dix was watching the small approaching light of the Princess Alice, with a very different eye. He had first seen her lamps some minutes before, when she was still upstream of the bend, and he had noted her then as a small pleasure steamer coming up from Gravesend on her return run. He had judged the distance carefully, and had reckoned upon a clear passing, port to port, in the ordinary way. As the two vessels drew nearer, however, he saw that the small steamer had begun to swing across his bow, from his own port side toward his starboard side, cutting across the reach in a slow, steady curve. This was not the pass he had expected. The rules of the river said that she should have held her course and given her port side to him. Instead, she was drawing herself into a position where, if he held his own course, he would strike her on his own starboard bow. For a long moment the pilot stood very still. He had seen this movement in other boats before, though never at such close quarters, and never in the darkness of a September night. He believed, in the private judgment of that moment, that the small steamer meant to cross his bow and pass him on the starboard side, that is, upon what would be his own right hand. It was, in the strict sense, a wrong pass. It was not what the rules required, but the small steamer had committed to it. She had shown him her starboard side, and her red port light had disappeared behind her stern, and only her green starboard light remained visible to him. If he held on straight, he would run her down. If he swung to his own starboard, in the way the rules required, he would strike her amidships, for she was already turning across his path. There was, he thought, only one thing to be done. He must give way. He must swing his own bow to port, into the northern side of the reach, and let the small boat go on across into the shelter of Tripcock, as she plainly intended. He gave the order to his helmsman, Henry Hardy, in a low, steady voice that betrayed no fear. Port the helm. Hard a port. Hardy put the wheel over. The long black bow of the Bywell Castle began, very slowly, very heavily, to swing toward the northern shore. Upon the bridge of the Princess Alice, Captain Grinstead saw it in the same instant. The masthead light of the collier had ceased to hold its steady bearing upon his own port bow. It was drifting now to the north. The green starboard light of the collier had grown brighter, and the red port light had begun to show as well, showing the whole face of the great iron ship. She was swinging her bow across the reach. She was coming, quite plainly, into the very water that he himself was crossing toward. In the dark, with the ebb running hard beneath both vessels, the captain saw with a sudden cold clearness that the pilot of the collier had misread his own intention, and had turned the wrong way to avoid him, and was now bearing straight down upon the Princess Alice as she made for the shelter of Tripcock Point. he shouted at once to John Ayres at the wheel. "Hard a port," he cried. "Hard a port." He meant to swing his own bow round to the north as well, to run parallel to the collier and let her pass upon his starboard side. Ayres spun the spokes. The paddles beat harder. The Princess Alice began to answer, very slowly, for she was a small boat and light in the water, and the ebb was running against her rudder. Her bow crept round toward the north, but she was already close under Tripcock Point. She had already given up half of her way. The current beneath her stern pushed her sideways in the reach, and the Bywell Castle, all 890 tons of her, empty of cargo and high in the water, was coming down upon her with the whole weight of the ebb behind her. The mate of the Princess Alice, who was upon the open deck with his lantern in his hand, saw the great black shape of the collier lift out of the dark ahead. He shouted a warning to the passengers, though there was little that any warning could do. Some who heard him lifted their heads. Some rose to their feet. Some only stared. The three sisters in white frocks slept on against the funnel, with their small boots dangling. The old grandmother in the black shawl opened her eyes and looked out at the water and did not understand what she saw. The Sunday school teachers from Wapping gathered their children a little closer to them upon the benches, and one small boy pointed at the great shape and asked what it was, and no one answered him. Upon the collier's bridge, the pilot Dix had by now seen his mistake, though there was no time left to undo it. The Princess Alice had begun her own swing to port, and the two boats were closing on the same line, each turning the same way, and the current was carrying both of them down. He gave the order to stop the engine, and to reverse the screw, and this order was rung down at once to the engine room below. The engineer, a Scotchman named MacGregor, threw over the levers with practised hands, and the great screw stopped its forward beat, and then began, very slowly, to turn the other way, biting the black water at her stern. Captain Harrison seized the whistle lanyard above his head and pulled it. The whistle of the Bywell Castle screamed out across the reach, a long, deep note that rolled over the marshes and echoed against the sheds of the arsenal upon the far shore. Captain Grinstead, upon the Princess Alice, pulled his own whistle also. The higher, softer note of the pleasure steamer answered the deep cry of the collier. The two whistles sounded together over the black water, in the dark, above the sleeping children and the tired women, and the men who had lit their evening pipes. They were the last warnings that could be given. Neither of them could stop what was already in motion. The distance had grown too short. The turn had grown too tight. The ebb was too strong. The iron bow of the Bywell Castle, painted black and still wet with its new coat, came on through the dark toward the small painted rail of the Princess Alice, as slowly and as surely as a great door closing upon a room. Upon the open deck a young father caught his little boy up into his arms. A mother pressed her sleeping baby harder to her shoulder. The newly married couple at the stern rail turned and saw the shape rising out of the dark ahead of them, and the young husband put his arm about his wife and drew her close against him and did not speak. The old grandmother in the black shawl reached out and took her son's hand in her own, the way she had done when he was a small boy and afraid of a thunderstorm. The dressmaker from Holborn woke her girl Jane, who had been asleep upon her shoulder, and Jane opened her eyes and saw only the sudden looming darkness above the rail. A steward carrying a tray of empty cups paused in the gangway with his mouth open and made no sound. The band was silent. The engine below thumped on. The paddles beat once, twice, 3 times against the tide. In the wheelhouse Captain Grinstead spoke a last quiet word to his helmsman. "Steady," he said. "Steady as she goes." It was, at that moment, the only word he had left to give. John Ayres held the wheel with both hands and did not move his eyes from the compass. The whistle above them screamed a second time, and then a third, and then it went silent. The collier's bow was very close now. It stood high above the small deck of the Princess Alice, higher than the funnel, higher than the mast, black against the stars. Its wet paint gleamed. Its anchor hung dark in its chock. A single lantern burned upon its bridge, and above the lantern the pale face of Pilot Dix could be seen for one long moment, looking down. And then the reach fell silent. The whistles had died. The wind had dropped. The stars burned hard and cold above the marshes. The paddles of the Princess Alice took one last stroke against the water, and the great iron bow of the Bywell Castle, driven on by the ebb and by her own long moment, came down through the darkness and touched at last the small white side of the pleasure steamer, just forward of her starboard paddle box, where the young mother sat with her 3 sleeping daughters, and the old grandmother held her son's hand, and the newly married couple stood together at the rail. The river opens its throat. The iron bow came down. It did not stop. It did not glance away. It bit deep into the white-painted side of the Princess Alice just forward of her starboard paddle box, and the sound of it was like nothing that had ever been heard upon that reach of the river. It was not one sound, but many. It was the sharp crack of pine planks giving way. It was the slow groan of an iron plate bending in upon itself. It was the shriek of a paddle wheel torn half from its shaft. It was the crash of the funnel as its stays parted, and the tall black pipe leaned suddenly against the sky. And beneath all of it, low and terrible, ran the deep, rushing note of the Thames itself, pouring in through the wound in her side. For one long moment the Princess Alice did not sink. She only heeled over toward the collier, as if she meant to lean against the great black bow that had struck her. The deck tilted. The benches slid a small way. The 3 sisters in white frocks rolled together against the funnel, and woke and did not cry out, for they did not yet understand. The old grandmother in the black shawl was thrown against her son. The dressmaker from Holborn threw out her arm to hold her girl Jane upon the seat. Cups slid from the tray of the steward in the gangway and broke upon the deck. A lantern near the wheelhouse fell from its hook and went out. The 2 whistles were silent now. Only the sound of the water was left, and the low, deep grinding of iron upon iron as the Bywell Castle drew slowly back out of the wound she had made. She drew back a little way, and then a little more. The ebb carried her clear. The great screw at her stern beat backward against the tide. Her long black side slid past the shattered paddle box of the Princess Alice, and where the 2 hulls had touched, there was a gash open to the water, wide as a stable door, and through it the river came in with a hard, steady roar. The Princess Alice righted herself for one small breath. She stood level again upon the water, as though nothing had happened, as though she might yet steam home. And then she began to break. She broke amidships. She broke where the iron bow had struck her. The pine planks of her upper deck split along the line of the wound, and the rail parted, and the funnel leaned further, and the tall black pipe came down at last with a slow, heavy fall across the deck. Steam roared up from the boilers below in a great white cloud that hid the stars. The engine kept turning for a moment longer, for the engineer at his post below did not yet know what had happened above him, and the paddles beat 2 more soft strokes against the tide. Then the water reached the fires. There was a hiss like the breath of some great creature. The steam pressure fell. The engine stopped. The paddles stopped. The lights upon her rails went out one by one. The forepart of the Princess Alice, holding perhaps a third of her passengers, tilted downward at the bow. The afterpart, holding the rest, tilted downward at the stern. The 2 halves settled toward the water like the 2 arms of a slow scale. Between them the Thames poured in and would not stop. Upon the forepart, near the bow, the Sunday school teachers from Wapping still sat with their 20 children. The head teacher, the thin, serious woman of 40, rose to her feet as the deck began to slope. She caught the smallest boy under her arm. She held out her other hand to the girl beside her. She spoke a few clear, steady words that no one afterwards remembered. She had never learned to swim. Neither had the children. Their small, hard leather boots and their heavy woolen coats and their wet skirts held them fast when the water came. She did not let go of the boy. The 2 of them were found in the morning still together, upon the mud below Woolwich. Upon the afterpart, near the stern, the newly married couple stood still at the port rail. The husband had his arm about his wife. He did not speak. He did not shout. He only held her. When the deck tilted beneath them, he lifted her a little and set her upon the top of the rail, and he told her to hold fast to him, and he stepped up beside her. The water came up quickly. It touched their feet. It rose to their knees. He said her name. She said his. and then the stern of the Princess Alice slid down into the Black River, and they went down together, and their hands did not part. In the morning they would be found upon the mud together also, still holding, and the coroner at Woolwich would order that they be buried in one grave. The three sisters in white frocks slid from their bench near the funnel. Their mother caught the youngest to her breast and held out her arms for the other two. The middle sister took her hand. The eldest was carried away in the first rush of water that came in over the rail. Her mother screamed her name once. There was no answer. The other two were pulled from her arms a moment later by the strong pull of the flooding deck. Their small white frocks showed for a moment upon the black water, and then were gone. The mother herself was pulled down after them. Only her shawl was found later, floating alone, tangled about the broken end of a bench. The old grandmother in the black shawl held her son's hand very tightly. She did not try to rise. She only looked at him. She had lived 74 years. She had seen 4 of her children buried. She had lost her husband to the cholera in the year 1854. She had known cold winters and hungry weeks and long nights of grief. She was not afraid of the water. She only did not want to be alone. Her son held her hand and said, softly, "Mother." The deck went out from under them together. The river closed over them together. He was pulled from the water by a rowing boat some hours later, alive but out of his senses. She was never found. Upon the crowded deck, a great crying began. It was not one cry, but 1,000 cries at once. Women called for their children by name. Children called for their mothers. Men shouted for help that could not come. A boy of about 10 climbed the rail near the wheelhouse and stood a moment upon the top of it and looked back at the great black side of the Bywell Castle drifting away in the dark, and then he jumped. He could swim a little. He had learned as a small boy in a canal near Poplar. He struck out for the northern shore. He did not reach it. Only a few among the whole company knew how to swim at all, for the swimming of the poor was not a common skill in that time, and the swimming of women was almost unknown, and the long skirts and the tight bodices of the women pulled them under before they could learn the trick of the water. The dressmaker from Holborn held her 3 girls by the arms. She had them together for one long moment against the rail of the sinking stern. Emily on the right, Sarah in the middle, Jane on the left. She spoke their names each once, calmly, as she had spoken their names each morning in the workroom above the shop in Holborn. Then the deck went, and the water came up, and only Sarah, who was tall and strong, and who caught a broken piece of the funnel casing as it drifted past, was pulled out alive by a waterman an hour later, half a mile down the reach. Emily and Jane were not found for many days. The band that had played the waltzes and the polkas had put their instruments away in soft cloth bags upon the bench beside them. The cornet player was a young man of 22 named Frederick Boncy. He had a wife in Islington and a small son of 8 months. When the funnel came down across the deck, he was struck upon the shoulder and thrown against the rail. He fell into the water and did not come up. His cornet, in its soft cloth bag, was found the next morning floating in the reach near the Beckton gasworks, and was later returned to his widow, who kept it upon the mantelpiece of her small room for the rest of her life. In the wheelhouse, Captain Grinstead stood at his post. He did not move. He gave one last order to John Ayres at the wheel, though the wheel no longer answered. He said softly, "Save yourself." Ayres would afterwards remember that word, and would say it to the coroner at Woolwich, and would weep as he said it. The captain himself did not move from his post. The wheelhouse tilted. The glass of the small window broke. The water rushed in about his feet, and then his knees, and then his chest. He held to the rail with one hand and to his cap with the other. He was 47 years old. He went down with his boat, as the old rule of the river said a captain must, and his body was found 4 days later on the mud below Barking Creek, and his wife came down from Woolwich to identify him, and she did not speak upon the whole journey home. Down below in the engine room, the engineer had thrown open the door of the boiler when the shock struck, and the fires were drowned in the first rush of water, and there was no explosion, for which small mercy the men of the trade were later grateful. The engineer himself, a Welshman named Long, climbed up the iron ladder toward the deck. Water came down the ladder to meet him. He fought against it for a long moment, and then it lifted him and carried him up, and by some strange gift of the tide, it carried him clear of the ladder and out through the broken deck plates and up into the open air, and he found himself on the surface of the reach, coughing, alive, holding to a floating grating. He would live. He was the only man from the engine room who lived. The stokers below did not come up. They had been feeding the boilers with their long shovels when the shock struck, and they were black to the elbows with the coal dust of the long day. The water came into the stokehold in a hard, cold flood. It knocked one man against the iron bulkhead. It caught another about the legs and pulled him down. The last of them tried the ladder as the engineer had done, but the water reached him before the top, and he was pulled back down into the black flooded chamber, and there he stayed. In the morning, when the divers came down from Trinity House with their brass helmets and their leaden boots, they would find the stokers still at their posts below the waterline, and would bring them up one by one into the cold September light. Upon the surface of the river, in the darkness, hundreds of people now thrashed for their lives. The water was cold, though not yet the cold of winter. The current of the ebb ran hard toward the sea. The banks lay far off on either side, 300 yards to the northern shore, 300 yards to the southern. The distance was not great for a strong swimmer in daylight. It was very great for a woman in a long woolen skirt at 8 o'clock on a September night, in a black tide, in the dark. The water was foul beyond any reckoning. That very evening, only an hour before, the great outfalls at Barking upon the northern shore and at Crossness upon the southern shore had opened their gates upon the falling tide, and the raw sewage of half the city of London had poured out into the Reach. The people of the Princess Alice came down into that water, and they breathed it, and they swallowed it, and those who did not drown at once were poisoned by it in the hours and days that followed, and many of the bodies later pulled from the tide were black about the mouths and the hands from what they had touched in the dark. In the space of 4 minutes the Princess Alice was gone. 4 minutes from the striking of the bow to the last settling of the stern. 4 minutes for a boat to break in two and to slide beneath the water. 4 minutes for 650 souls to be thrown into a black tide in the middle of the Reach. There was no lifeboat that could be lowered in that time. There was no rope that could be thrown to more than a few. There was only the water and the cries and the small pale hands that reached up from the surface in the dark, and the great black shape of the Bywell Castle drifting slowly downstream, her engine reversed, her whistle silent now, her captain and her pilot standing upon her bridge, in a silence that would follow them to the grave. The forepart of the Princess Alice sank first. The afterpart followed within a minute. The tall funnel lay across the deck for one last moment above the surface, its black paint slick and wet, and then it too went down, and the river closed above it, and the wake of the sinking spread out in a slow, wide ring across the black water of Galleon's Reach. Where a boat had been, there was now only broken wood and floating shawls, and the pale patches of women's blouses turning slowly in the tide. And rising above it, thin and dreadful and small against the great silence of the marshes, came the cries of those who still lived, calling out into the dark for anyone at all who might yet hear them. And along the northern shore, at the Arsenal, and the southern shore, at Plumstead, the first lanterns had begun to appear along the banks, moving toward the water. The drowning hour. The cries came thin and small across the black water. They rose from a stretch of the Reach no wider than a village green, and they were the cries of hundreds of throats at once. And yet in the great dark of the marshes they seemed a small sound. Some called out names. Some called out only the word help over and over until the water took the word away. Some did not call at all, for they had swallowed too much of the tide already and could only cough and choke and reach up with one hand for a hold that was not there. The ebb ran hard beneath them all. It carried them slowly downstream, together, spread out in a long drifting cloud of pale faces and dark cloth, past the low point of Tripcock, past the mouth of Barking Creek upon the northern shore, out into the wider water below. The cold was not the cold of winter. The month was September, and the day had been warm, and the water still held a small memory of the summer. But cold enough it was for those who came into it in their evening clothes, in their long woolen skirts, in their thick serge coats, in their hard leather boots that filled at once and pulled them down. The women went first. Their skirts were made in the fashion of the day, of heavy stuff, cut full at the hem and gathered thick at the waist, and lined with layers of stiff cotton and horsehair. A dry skirt of that make weighed several pounds. A wet skirt weighed the weight of a small child. It wrapped about the legs. It closed above the boots. It would not lift. The women who had known no swimming in their lives, who had never in all their years put their heads beneath the water even in a bath, felt their skirts pulled downward with a slow, patient strength that no arm could fight, and one by one they slid below the surface with their eyes still open and their hands still reaching. The men fared little better. Their coats were of heavy cloth. Their waistcoats were buttoned close. Their trousers held the water in the folds. Their boots were of thick leather with iron nails in the sole. Only a few of them had ever learned to swim, for the swimming of the working men of London was not much taught in that time, and the river itself was not a river in which anyone would willingly bathe. Those few who could swim struck out at once for the nearest shore. Some made it. Most did not. The current was strong. The distance was longer than it looked. The dark hid the banks. A strong young man of 20, a printer's apprentice from Clerkenwell, swam for the northern shore with a steady stroke that he had learned in the sea at Margate one summer as a boy. He was pulled from the water 3/4 of an hour later by a waterman near the Arsenal pier, alive but grey about the mouth, and he could not speak for a full day afterwards. The water itself was worse than cold. It was foul beyond anything that the passengers of the Princess Alice had ever known. That very evening, at the turning of the tide, the great outfalls of the northern and the southern sewers had opened their sluice gates upon the ebb. From the northern shore, at Barking Creek, 75 million gallons of raw sewage had poured out into the Reach. From the southern shore, at Crossness, another 75 million gallons had poured out to meet it. It was the way of the city. The drains of half of London emptied twice a day into these two channels, and the sluices were opened only when the tide would carry the filth away toward the sea. On this evening, the sluices had opened at about 6. By 8, when the Princess Alice broke in two, the raw waste of a great city hung suspended in the Reach on either side of Tripcock Point, black and thick and slow to move. Into this water the people of the Princess Alice came down. They swallowed it as they gasped. They breathed it in when the waves closed over them. They rubbed it into their eyes with wet hands as they tried to see. Those who lived to tell of it would speak afterwards, in the dead house at Woolwich and in the coroner's court, of the taste. It was, they said, the worst thing about the whole of that dreadful hour. They said it before they said any other thing. Even more than the cold. Even more than the dark. Even more than the crying of the children in the water beside them. The children died fast. Their small bodies had little warmth to give up. Their small lungs held little air. Their heavy little boots and their long cotton pinafores and their thick knitted stockings pulled them down as surely as the skirts of their mothers. The 3 sisters in white frocks, the little daughters of the young mother from Bow, went under one by one within the first minute. The eldest, who had been swept away by the first rush of water on the deck, was carried down the Reach by the ebb, and was found the next morning caught in the reeds below Barking. The middle sister was pulled down almost at once by her wet clothes. The youngest, the baby that her mother had held to her breast, was still in her mother's arms when both were pulled from the tide 2 days later, 4 miles downstream near Erith. The mother's hands had frozen tight upon the child. When the men on the boat tried to lift them apart, they could not. Mother and daughter were buried together in one coffin at Woolwich Old Cemetery. The Sunday school teachers from Wapping went down in a group. They had gathered their 20 children to them on the sinking deck, and they did not let go when the water came. Some of the older boys struck out and tried to swim, and 2 of them lived. The rest were pulled down together, tangled in one another's clothes, in the crowded shadow of the funnel casing. In the morning they would be found in a long, slow drift near the marshes at Crossness, laid out by the water in a ragged line, still in the neat Sunday clothes their mothers had washed and pressed for them the night before. The head teacher was found with the smallest boy still in her arms. He had held her about the neck. Her hand was still upon his back. Neither of them was any more than 7 stone in weight, and the two of them together were lifted into a rowing boat by a single waterman with no help at all, so light had the water made them. Not all who fell into the reach died at once. Many held to broken pieces of the boat. The tall funnel had fallen across the deck as she sank, and it had broken apart when it struck the water, and its long curved plates now floated black upon the tide. Men and women clung to these plates and were carried slowly downstream. A section of the wooden rail had come loose and floated whole, and 8 or 9 people took hold of it at once, and it kept them up for a little while, until one and then another lost their grip and were pulled away by the current. The oilcloth covers of the benches, which the stewards folded beneath the seats for use in bad weather, had floated up out of the wreck, and here and there a woman held to one of them like to a small dark raft. A wooden hatch cover from the forepart of the boat carried 3 men for a full quarter-mile before it turned in the tide and threw them off. The stronger men helped as they could. There were among the passengers a few soldiers of the line, in scarlet coats, who had come aboard at Gravesend on their evening leave. One of them, a sergeant of the West Kent regiment named Hardy, no relation to the helmsman of the collier, could swim well. He had lived as a boy at Margate, and had gone into the sea every summer of his youth. When the deck went from under him, he came up at once, and struck the water with a strong, steady arm. He saw a woman near him, sinking, and he seized her by the collar of her coat, and dragged her to a floating piece of the rail, and set her hands upon it, and told her to hold on. He swam then to another, a young girl of perhaps 16, and did the same. He brought a third to the rail, and a fourth. On the 5th he could bring no one. His own strength had gone. He held to the rail himself, gasping. He and the 4 he had saved were pulled from the water 3/4 of an hour later by a small boat from the arsenal, and all of them lived. He was afterwards given a medal by the Royal Humane Society. He did not wear it. He said that it was for those he had not saved, and he could not look upon it without their faces. There were others like him. A stoker off a passing barge, who had jumped from his own vessel into a small boat when he saw the wreck, and had rowed alone into the crowd of the drowning, pulled 7 people from the tide, and would not stop rowing until his own hands bled. A boy of 14, an errand boy for a chandler at Woolwich, who had been standing at the Arsenal pier when he heard the whistles and the crying, took a small skiff without asking anyone's leave, and rowed out into the dark alone, and brought back 3 women in the bottom of the boat, all of them alive. A waterman of the Reach named William Groves, whose barge lay at anchor a little way upstream, launched his own dinghy the moment the sound of the collision reached him, and he pulled all through the night without rest, and by dawn he had brought in 19 souls, of whom 11 still lived. But these were few. The night was dark. The boats were few. The Bywell Castle herself, standing off downstream with her engine reversed and her lights burning, at first did not know how many souls were in the water. Her captain, Thomas Harrison, and her pilot, Christopher Dix, both stood upon her bridge in a silence that was afterwards said to have been terrible to see. The captain ordered every boat he had to be lowered at once. There were 4 boats upon the Bywell Castle. The falls were made ready. The crew leaped to their stations. But the collier lay in the middle of the reach, and her deck stood high above the water, and the lowering of the boats in the dark, with the tide running hard, took more minutes than any man there had known it could take. When at last the first boat touched the water and the men bent to their oars, the greater part of those who had come off the Princess Alice were already gone. The Bywell Castle's boats brought in perhaps 50. Some of those 50 were dead already when the boats reached them. From the northern shore, at the pier of the arsenal, the alarm had begun to sound. A watchman upon the wharf had seen the 2 lights come together in the dark, and had heard the whistles cry out and then fall silent. He had run at once to the guard-room. Within a very few minutes the arsenal bell was ringing, and men were pouring out onto the pier, and boats were being run down the wooden slips into the water. From the southern shore, at the small stairs near Plumstead Marshes, the local watermen had also heard the crying across the water, and they too were putting out. Lanterns began to move upon the water. Small orange lights bobbed on the black tide. Voices called across the reach. Somewhere in the middle of it all, the survivors held to their broken planks and their oilcloth covers and their wooden rails, and cried out to the lanterns as they came near, and were pulled up one by one into the small boats, gasping, shaking, sick to the stomach from what they had swallowed. Some were lifted out too late. A young woman was pulled into a skiff off Tripcock Point, still holding a small bundle to her chest. When the boatman turned her a little to lay her in the bottom of the boat, the bundle came open. It was a baby, 3 months old, wrapped in a shawl. The baby was dead. The mother was dead also. She had held the child up out of the water for as long as she could, and it was afterwards judged by the coroner that she had done so long past the moment when she herself might have swum for the shore. She had chosen the child. The boatman, an older man who had pulled bodies from the Thames for 30 years, laid mother and child down together in the bottom of the skiff and rowed toward the Arsenal pier without speaking. When he reached the pier, he could not lift them out. Another man had to come and take them from him. The old grandmother in the black shawl was not among those pulled from the water alive. Her son, who had held her hand as the deck went out from under them, was picked up 1/2 mile downstream, clinging to a wooden hatch cover, out of his senses, unable to say his own name. He would live. He would carry the memory of her hand in his for the rest of his years, and he would speak of it only once, to the coroner, and then never again. The newly married couple were not pulled up either. They had gone down together at the stern rail, holding to one another, and the ebb had carried them a little way down the reach before the water closed over them. They would be found in the morning upon the mud below Woolwich, still holding, and would be buried in a single grave. By 8:30, the surface of Galleon's Reach lay very quiet. The crying had almost stopped. Here and there, from a floating plank or from a piece of the funnel casing, a small voice still called out, weaker than before. Here and there, a hand still lifted above the water. But the great cloud of sound that had risen at the moment of the sinking had thinned now to a scatter of small pleas, and the lanterns moved among them slowly, one by one, taking each in turn. Along the northern shore, the Arsenal pier had begun to fill with rows of the living wrapped in blankets, and with rows of the dead laid quietly side by side upon the boards. Along the southern shore, at Plumstead, the same thing was happening in a smaller way, by the light of a single lantern held up in the hand of a boy. And in the darkness in the middle of the reach, the great black shape of the Bywell Castle lay still upon the tide, her whistle silent, her boats out, her captain standing at his rail and looking down at the water where the Princess Alice had been. The Lanterns of Woolwich. The lanterns came down to the water first. From the Arsenal pier they came in a slow line, held in the hands of men who had run from the guard-room and from the workshops and from the small brick houses along Beresford Street. They were the lanterns of the trade, iron-framed, with thick glass panes and small brass rings for the carrying. Each one held a stub of tallow candle or a wick set in a shallow well of paraffin. They gave off a low yellow light, weak against the great dark of the reach, but they were enough. Enough to find a floating shawl. Enough to find a small pale face turned up to the sky. Enough to catch the pale gleam of a woman's hand still lifted above the tide. The men of the Arsenal had come out in numbers now. There were soldiers of the Royal Artillery in their dark blue tunics, and workmen in canvas aprons, and clerks in shirt-sleeves, and a small party of the police in their tall helmets. The wharf-master of the Arsenal, a stout man named Roberts, had taken the running of the pier upon himself. He stood at the head of the wooden stairs and shouted his orders, in a voice that carried across the water. Boats out. Blankets up from the storeroom. Send word to the doctor. Send word to the superintendent. Send word to Woolwich Town Pier. Get the fires lit in the guardhouse. Get the tea on. The men jumped to his voice. Within a quarter hour there were 7 small boats already upon the water, pulling out into the reach with 2 men at the oars of each, and a third man in the stern with a lantern held high. The lanterns of the Arsenal were joined now by others. From Woolwich Town Pier, 1/2 mile upstream, the watermen of the borough had put out in their skiffs and their wherries. They knew the reach better than any soldier. They knew the run of the ebb below Tripcock. They knew where a body would drift on such a tide, and where it would fetch up against the reeds, and where it would be swept clear out into the flats below Barking. They rowed with the long, steady stroke of the trade, their lanterns swinging at the bow, their eyes searching the black water for the small, pale patches that were faces and hands. From the southern shore, at Plumstead, the fishermen had come out also. There were not many of them, for the great works had eaten up much of the old shore trade, but there were enough. Old William Groves, who had already pulled 19 from the tide, was still upon the water, though his hands were bleeding now through the palms of his mittens, and his back ached with a pain he did not feel. A younger man, a boat builder named Cracknell, had launched a light rowing boat from the small stairs by the marsh, and had brought in 4 already. A boy of 15, the son of the ferryman at North Woolwich, had taken his father's dinghy without asking, and had come out alone into the reach with a candle in a jam jar for a light. The Bywell Castle herself had let down all 4 of her boats. Her crew were North Country men, unused to the Thames, but they were seamen, and they knew how to pull an oar. Her chief officer, a thin, quiet man named Purcell, took the first boat himself. He rowed straight into the drifting cloud of survivors and did not waste a stroke. His men lifted a woman first, and then a young man, and then a child of about 4 who was still, by some miracle, breathing. They laid these bodies in the bottom of the boat and pulled on. The second boat brought in 3 more. The third brought in 2. The fourth brought in only 1, a man already dead, whom they had lifted from a piece of the funnel casing, where he had held on until his heart gave out. Upon the bridge of the Bywell Castle, Captain Harrison had not moved. He stood at the rail and watched the boats go out into the dark, and he watched them come back to the side of his ship one by one, and he watched the living and the dead lifted up over her rail in the small yellow light of the deck lanterns. He had ordered blankets brought up from the crew's quarters. He had ordered the galley fire lit, and hot tea made and hot water put ready in tin pails. He gave these orders in a low, steady voice, and his men obeyed him, and no one spoke of what had happened above Tripcock Point. Beside him stood Pilot Dix, who did not speak at all. The pilot had taken off his cap. He held it in both hands. He looked down at the water and did not lift his eyes for a long while. The boats went out and came back. They went out and came back. Each time they brought fewer of the living and more of the dead. By 9 o'clock the crying upon the water had almost stopped. By 9:30 it had ceased altogether, save for the small weak call that came now and then from a piece of drifting wreckage, and that too grew rarer with every quarter hour. By 10 there was only the sound of the oars in the rowlocks, and the low voices of the men in the boats, and the slap of the tide against the sides of the Bywell Castle. The lanterns moved slowly across the black water, searching, dipping, lifting again. At the arsenal pier the bodies had begun to come in. The first was a young woman in a grey travelling dress, whom the men lifted in a blanket up the wooden stairs and laid upon the boards near the guardhouse. Her hair had come loose from its pins. Her mouth was full of the black filth of the Reach. A soldier of the artillery, a young man of perhaps 22, took a clean handkerchief from his own pocket and wiped her mouth and her face before he laid her down. He did not know her. He did not ask her name. He only did the small, decent thing that seemed to him then to need doing. He would do it again that night for many others. More came up the stairs. The wharf-master Roberts had cleared a long space upon the boards between the guardhouse and the store, and here the dead were laid in rows side by side, with a small distance between each, so that families might later walk between them. Blankets had been brought from the arsenal store, and each body was covered from throat to boot with a coarse grey blanket of army issue, and the face left uncovered for the naming. A soldier stood at each end of the row, with a lantern held low, so that the faces might be seen. It was quiet upon the pier now. The shouting had stopped. The men worked in silence, or spoke only in low words, and there was no other sound but the water beneath the boards and the tramp of a boot upon wood. The living were carried into the guardhouse. There was a fire lit in the small iron stove, and pots of tea stood upon the hob, and the wife of one of the sergeants, a woman of about 40 named Ellen Reeve, had come down from her cottage in her night shawl to help. She wrapped each survivor in a dry blanket and put a hot cup into their hands, and did not leave them until they had drunk it. She was, by every account of that night, a small, stern, kind woman who did not shrink from the wet clothes or the sour smell of the tide upon them. She washed the mouths of the children with a clean cloth. She combed out the hair of a young girl who could not yet speak. She held the hand of a young man from Bethnal Green, who lay upon the guardroom floor and shook without stopping. She would sit with him for 2 full hours before he could say his own name. The wounded were taken further, up to the Arsenal Hospital, which stood behind the pier. There the surgeons of the garrison had been called from their supper. Dr. Millar, the chief surgeon, met each stretcher at the door. He had served in India and in the Crimea, and he had seen many things in his time, but he had never seen this. There were burns upon some of the survivors from the escaping steam of the burst boilers. There were broken arms from the falling of the funnel. There were bruises upon almost every one of them from the crushing of the deck as she went down. And there was the poison. Almost every one of the living had swallowed some of the reach. The surgeons brought pails and basins and did what they could. Many were made to vomit at once. Others were given warm brandy and honey to drink. A few were beyond any help, and were laid quietly upon the far side of the ward and given only what small ease could be given them, and they went out one by one before the morning. The engineer Long, the Welshman who had been carried up out of the flooded stokehold by the very tide that killed his fellows, was among those brought to the hospital. He had held to a floating grating for nearly an hour before a waterman pulled him in. He could barely stand upon the pier. When they laid him upon a bed in the ward, he began to weep, quietly, without any sound, and Dr. Millar sat by him for a long while and did not speak. The engineer would live. He would never work upon a steamer again. Down the reach at the Beckton gasworks, upon the northern shore, a small pier stood out into the water for the coaling of the barges, and here too the bodies had begun to come. The tide had carried them down past the outfalls, past the mouth of Barking Creek, and now they turned in the slower water near the gasworks and drifted toward the shore. The men of the gasworks, black-faced from the retorts, came down from their shift with lanterns and pulled the bodies up onto the pier. There was no room for them there, for the pier was narrow, and so a cart was fetched from the yard, and the bodies were laid in the cart and driven the short way to the works, and there they were placed in a long shed that in ordinary times held stacks of iron pipe. 20 were laid in that shed before the night was out. At Woolwich Town Pier, upstream of the Arsenal, the same slow gathering was going on. The town pier stood in the working part of the borough, and it was smaller than the Arsenal Pier, and less well suited to such a work, but the watermen had brought in many of their rescued there, for it was the pier they knew best. The bodies were carried up from the boats through the crowd that had gathered on the pier as the news went out. Women had come down from the streets in their shawls with their hair unpinned. Men had come down in their shirt sleeves, and boys in bare feet. Every face bent over each new body that was carried up, in the hope and the fear of naming a kin. Sometimes there was a small cry of recognition, and a woman would fall to her knees upon the boards. Sometimes there was only a shake of the head, and the body was carried on. The word had gone up to London by then. A telegraph clerk at Woolwich, a young man of 20 named Fisher, had gone to his quay at 8:30 when the first boats came in, and had sent the news up the wires to the office at Charing Cross. From Charing Cross, the news went out to Fleet Street. By 10, the printers of the great papers were setting type in a hurry, and by midnight the first special editions were being run off the presses in Bouverie Street and in Salisbury Square. Boys were sent out with the papers into the streets of the West End, calling the news through the gaslight. Loss of the Princess Alice. Great disaster upon the Thames. Many hundreds feared drowned. In the coffee rooms of the clubs and in the small saloons of the theatres, men set down their glasses and stared at the boys with the papers and did not, at first, believe. At Silvertown, at Poplar, at Bow, at Bethnal Green, at Wapping, at Clerkenwell, at Holborn, at Islington, at Hackney, the wives and the mothers had not yet heard the news. They were waiting up for the sound of the boat's whistle at Swan Pier, or for the sound of a boot upon the stair, or for the small cry of a child at the door. Some had laid a supper upon the table, and were keeping it warm at the hob. Some had drawn back the counterpane upon a small bed, and were waiting to lift a tired child into it. Some had put out a candle upon the mantelpiece, and were sitting quiet by the fire with the knitting in their lap. The whistle did not come. The boots did not come. The children did not come. And somewhere out in the darkness above the Thames, a boy with a paper was already running through the streets, calling the news. At the Arsenal pier the rows had grown. By 11 at night there were 60 bodies laid upon the boards. By midnight there were 90. The lanterns of the men at each end of the row still burned, though the wicks had been trimmed once already. The wharfmaster Roberts had gone up to his small office and had begun the writing of a list. He wrote each body by number, in a fair round hand, in a large ledger that had been brought down from the Arsenal store. Number 1. Female, aged about 30, dark hair, wedding ring, no other mark. Number 2. Female, aged about 7, white frock, black boots. Number 3. Male, aged about 40, dark suit, gold watch in waistcoat pocket, initials W.H. engraved on the case. He wrote steadily, without hurry. He did not lift his eyes when a new body was carried past his window. He knew that in the morning the families would come and would want each small detail, and he meant that they should find it. The tide slackened at last, near 1 o'clock in the morning. The ebb had run itself out. The water in the reach lay still. The lanterns upon the boats began to draw together. There were fewer to pull up now, and those that were pulled up were beyond any help. The watermen rested upon their oars. Old William Grove sat for the first time in 5 hours and let another man take his oars, and he laid his hands, palm upward, in his lap and did not speak. The boy of 15 from North Woolwich fell asleep sitting up in the stern of his father's dinghy, and a soldier lifted him gently ashore at the Arsenal pier and carried him into the guardhouse and laid him by the fire. Upon the deck of the Bywell Castle, Captain Harrison at last stepped back from the rail and turned to Pilot Dix and said only that the boats might come in now. The pilot nodded. He put his cap back upon his head. Neither man had spoken any other word in almost 5 hours. The lanterns of Woolwich stayed lit through the rest of the night, along the pier, in the guardhouse, in the ward of the hospital, in the small office where the wharfmaster kept his list. Above the reach the stars had turned. A cold thin wind had risen from the east. A little after 4 o'clock, a faint grey line began to show at the edge of the sky over the marshes, and the tide had begun, very slowly, to lift again, and to carry with it the last of the drifting shawls and the small pale hands, and to bring them, one by one, into the light of the coming day. The long reckoning. The dawn came grey and slow over Woolwich. The sky above the marshes turned from black to a soft dull pearl, and the reach below Tripcock Point lay flat and still, as though it had forgotten the work of the night. A thin mist rose from the water. The gulls came in from the sea and wheeled above the Arsenal pier, crying out and settling at last upon the wooden rails. The tide had turned. It carried up now, slowly, from below, and it brought with it the last of the drifting things. A shawl, a straw bonnet, a small brown boot, a sheet of pale blue paper that had once been a return ticket to Rosherville Gardens. At the Arsenal pier the lanterns were burned down to their stubs. The watermen who had pulled all night sat in a long line upon the boards with their backs against the guardhouse wall. Some of them had fallen asleep sitting up. Others held tin cups of tea that had gone cold in their hands. The wharfmaster Roberts came out of his small office with the ledger under his arm. He had written through the night. His fingers were black with ink. His eyes were red. He walked slowly along the row of the dead and lifted the corner of each blanket in turn and checked his numbers and let the blanket fall again. There were now 120 in the row. The first families came before the sun was fully up. They came on foot, most of them, from Woolwich town, from Plumstead, from Charlton, from the little streets that ran back from the river. They came with shawls thrown over their night-dresses. They came with children in their arms. They came with the small hard step of people who did not yet believe. A soldier stood at the pier gate and took each name and each errand and let them through one by one. There was to be no crowd upon the boards. There was to be no noise. Dr. Millar had said so, and Roberts had said so, and the pier constable had said so, and it was done as they said. Each family walked the length of the row. A blanket was lifted. A face was looked upon. A blanket was let fall. Sometimes the family walked on. Sometimes they did not. When they did not, a small, quiet cry went up from the boards, and Roberts came forward with his ledger, and he wrote down the name, and he wrote down the address, and he wrote down the small, careful details of a wedding ring, or a watch chain, or a mother's brooch, and the family was led away to the guardhouse to sit by the fire until a cart could be found to take the body home. A young woman came looking for her mother. Her mother had gone down to Rosherville with the Sunday school party from Wapping. The daughter had waited up all night in a small kitchen in Cable Street, with a candle burning upon the table. She had come down to Woolwich on the first train of the morning, still in the plain black dress she had put on the evening before. She walked the row twice. She did not find her mother. She sat down upon a bench near the guardhouse, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she did not weep. She would come back every day for the next 11 days. On the 12th day her mother would be brought in from the mud below barking, and she would know her by the small silver ring upon the third finger of her left hand, a ring her mother had worn since her wedding day in the year 1851. A father came looking for his 3 little daughters. He had not been aboard the boat. He worked as a night porter at a hotel in Piccadilly, and he had come off his shift at 6 that morning and had learned the news at the door of the Cannon Street station from a paper boy. He had ridden down to Woolwich in a hansom cab, and had paid the driver a shilling more than the fare, and had run the last piece from the gate on foot. He walked the row of the small ones first. He found the youngest. He found the middle. He did not find the eldest. He sat down upon the boards beside the 2 small bodies, and he took off his coat, and he laid it across them, though they were already covered by the blanket, and he stayed there without moving until the constable came at last and helped him to his feet. His wife would be brought in the next day. By 8 in the morning the Arsenal pier could hold no more. The row had grown too long. The wharf-master Roberts sent word up to the town hall of Woolwich, and word was sent back that the boardroom of the steam packet company on the town pier had been given over for the purpose, and that the drill hall of the Royal Marines behind the dockyard had been cleared also, and that the church hall at Holy Trinity in Beresford Street would be opened at 9. The bodies were carried on stretchers up from the pier, in slow, steady lines, along the road behind the arsenal, past the small shops which had drawn down their blinds for the day. The women of Woolwich stood in their doorways as the stretchers passed. Some of them held out cups of tea to the stretcher-bearers. Some of them stood in silence with their hands folded before them. At the Steam Packet Company boardroom, the tables and the chairs had been carried out into the yard. The floor had been strewn with clean sawdust. The bodies were laid in rows upon the sawdust, and a screen of dark cloth was hung across the great window that faced the street, so that those without would not see. Above the doorway, a small paper notice was pinned. It read only, "The dead of the Princess Alice. May God rest them." At the drill hall the same slow work went on. At Holy Trinity the vicar himself, an old man of 70 named Boyd, opened the doors at 9 and stood upon the threshold until noon. He did not preach. He did not pray aloud. He only stood there in his black coat and greeted each family that came in with a small bow of his head, and led them himself to the row of the dead, and stayed near them while they looked. He had buried his own daughter of the cholera in the year 1866. He knew what was needed. He knew what was not. The coroner of West Kent was Charles Joseph Carter. He was a plain man of about 60, in a dark suit and a white cravat, and he had held the office for many years. Word had gone to him at his house in Plumstead before 6 in the morning, and he had come down to the arsenal at once, and had looked upon the row upon the pier, and had said only that the inquest would open the next day at Woolwich Town Hall. He then set about the work that no coroner in the memory of the trade had ever been asked to do. He must hold an inquest upon each of the dead. He must swear a jury for each. He must hear the evidence for each. He must return a verdict upon each. There were, by his own reckoning that morning, already more than 140 bodies laid out in the town of Woolwich, and more coming in with every hour of the tide, and there would be more, he knew, for many days. He would need help. He asked for it, and he was given it. 2 of his deputies were sent for. A large jury of local men was impanelled. A room upon the ground floor of the town hall was set aside as his court. A clerk was set at a table with a great blue book, and a jug of ink, and a fresh pen. The coffin makers of Woolwich began their work at 7. The trade had never been busy in the town, and there were only 4 small workshops between the arsenal and the town pier. The oldest of these belonged to a man named Broadbent, who had made coffins in Beresford Street for 30 years, and who now stood at the door of his shop in his shirt-sleeves, and looked at the ledger his son had brought him from the pier. His son was pale and had not slept. Broadbent counted the numbers with his finger. Then he took off his apron and folded it neatly and put on his coat, and he walked down the street to the yard of the timber merchant, and he ordered every plank of pine that the yard had upon its shelves. He then walked to the 2nd coffin-maker, and to the 3rd, and to the 4th, and he asked them all to come to his shop at noon. When they came, he set his own timber before them, and he said that the trade of Woolwich would meet this thing together, and that there would be no charging one against the other for the work. The 4 men shook hands upon it in the sawdust of his floor. Then they set to work, and by nightfall they had begun to send out plain pine coffins upon carts to the halls where the dead were laid. Down at the Reach the divers had come. Trinity House had sent them down from London before dawn, in a small steam launch, with all their gear. They were 3 men. Their names were Highland, Cross, and Wilson. They wore the great brass helmets of the trade, and the heavy canvas suits, and the leaden boots. They went down first upon the forepart of the Princess Alice, which lay upon her side in about 18 feet of water off Tripcock Point. They walked upon her deck in the black tide. They felt their way among the broken planks. They brought up, in the first hour, 3 bodies. In the 2nd hour, 4. In the 3rd hour, 5. They brought up the stokers from the flooded stokehold. They brought up the engineer's boy from beside the cold boiler. They brought up a young woman who had been caught in the doorway of the small saloon and had not been able to pass through it. They brought them up one by one, and each was laid upon the deck of the launch with a clean sailcloth over the face, and the launch carried them the short way in to the Arsenal pier. The Board of Trade had sent its own men to Woolwich before the morning was out. The chief inspector was a Captain Bedford Pym, a naval officer of long service, and he came down upon the first train from Charing Cross with 2 clerks and a bundle of blank paper. He set up his office in a small room at the town hall, next to the coroner's court. He began at once to take the statements of the survivors as they were brought to him. He wrote in a small, neat hand. He did not raise his voice. He did not press any man who could not yet speak. He waited. He listened. He wrote. His inquiry and the inquest of Mr. Cartar would run side by side through the whole of the autumn and into the winter, and between them they would take down the words of some 400 witnesses, and they would fill volumes of blue paper that still lie today upon the shelves of the archive. Captain Grinstead was brought in at 10 that morning. His body had been found on the mud below Barking Creek by a boy who had gone out to gather wood at the low tide. He was still in his double-breasted coat with the brass buttons of the company. His peaked cap was gone. His watch was gone. His face was calm. He was laid in the row at the Steam Packet Company boardroom, and Roberts wrote his number in the ledger, and word was sent up to his house in Woolwich. His wife came down within the hour. She was a small, quiet woman of about 40, in a grey shawl, and she walked the length of the row without a sound until she reached her husband, and then she knelt upon the sawdust beside him and laid her hand upon his cheek and said his name once. She stayed with him until the coffin came. She did not speak to Mr. Broadbent or to the men who brought the coffin. She only nodded when they asked her leave. Then she walked home behind the cart, alone, in the middle of the morning. The pilot Christopher Dix was called before Captain Pym at noon. He came in his long grey coat with the collar turned up, and he sat down in the small chair at the table, and he took off his cap, and he laid it upon his knee. Captain Pym asked him to tell in his own words what had happened above Tripcock Point. The pilot began to speak, and his voice was steady enough for the first minute, and then it was not. He put his hand upon his forehead. He said, quietly, that he had thought the small steamer meant to cross his bow. He said he had put his own helm to port to give her the room. He said he had seen her turning at the same time, and that he had known then that they were both turning the same way, and that there was no more time. He said the whistle had sounded, and he had rung down to stop the engine, and he had ordered the screw reversed, and it had not been enough. He said he was a licensed pilot of the Trinity House, and had brought many hundreds of ships up and down this reach, and had never in his life struck another vessel. Then he could speak no further. Captain Pym wrote it all down without lifting his eyes. By the evening of that first day, the count stood at just above 300. By the next evening it stood at 450. By the end of the week it would climb towards 600. It would never quite be settled, for some of the passengers of the Princess Alice had bought their tickets on the day and had left no record of their names, and some had come aboard at Gravesend without booking at all, and some would be carried by the tide many miles down the reach and would not be found for weeks. In the end, the coroner would settle upon 650 souls lost, though older watermen of the reach would say to the end of their days that the number had been greater. The bells of Woolwich began to ring at 6 in the evening. Holy Trinity rang first, then St. Mary Magdalene, then the chapel of the Arsenal. They rang a slow single note, the passing bell, and they rang it not once for a soul, but many hundreds of times. The bells rolled out across the reach and across the marshes and across the flat river that had lain so still all day. The women of the town came out into their small backyards and stood a moment listening. The men in the workshops laid down their tools. The children in the streets stopped their games. In the small kitchens of Silvertown and Poplar and Bow, the wives who had not yet learned the fate of their husbands and their children heard those bells across the water, and they set down their work, and they went to the doors of their houses, and they looked out into the coming dusk, and they knew. The candle burns low. The bells of Woolwich rang for 3 days. They rang at the passing of each cart from the halls to the burial ground, and they rang at the closing of each small procession at the gate of the cemetery, and they rang at the falling of each evening upon the reach. The people of the town grew used to the sound in a way that no one had ever wished to grow used to. A woman going to the pump for water in the morning would pause and listen and cross herself and go on. A boy running an errand to the baker would slow his step at the door and take off his cap and hold it in both hands. The bells did not stop for meals, nor for the dark, nor for the rain that fell upon the second day and washed the sawdust from the boards of the Steam Packet Company yard. The burial ground stood at the top of King's Highway, above the town, in a plain field bordered by a low brick wall. It was called Woolwich Old Cemetery, though it was not old, only older than the other. The sexton was a lean, quiet man named Waller, who had held the office for 12 years, and who had never in that time buried more than 2 of a day. On the morning of the 5th of September he was called to the vestry and told what would be required of him. He did not answer at once. Then he only nodded and put on his coat and walked up to the ground alone in the early light and paced out the piece of earth that would be needed. The graves were dug in a long trench along the western wall. There were 4 trenches in the end. The first was cut on the 5th day, the second on the 7th, the third on the 9th, the 4th on the 12th. Each was 6 feet deep and wide enough to take 2 coffins abreast. The men who dug them worked in shifts of 4, with spades borrowed from the yards along the Arsenal wall. The clay came up heavy and yellow in the September sun. It was laid in a long ridge behind the trench and covered with sacking, and would be shovelled back in slow, careful spadefuls as each coffin was lowered and named. The coffins came up the hill in a slow, steady stream. Broadbent's shop and the 3 others sent them out in pine wood, plain, without varnish, with a small brass plate upon each lid. On the plate was written the number from the wharf-master's ledger, and beneath the number the name, where a name had been found, and beneath the name the parish. Some plates carried only a number and the word unknown. There were, in the end, more than 120 of those. They were laid together in one part of the trench, and a single tall wooden cross was set at the head of them, and a small board was fixed to the cross with the words, "Here rest the unnamed dead of the Princess Alice, 3rd of September, 1878. The mourners came in their thousands. They came by train from London, from Charing Cross and from Cannon Street, in the cheap black clothes of the working poor. They came from Bethnal Green and from Wapping and from Silvertown and from Poplar, in carts if they could hire them, on foot if they could not. They walked up King's Highway in a long, slow line that stretched from the Arsenal Gate almost to the cemetery wall. There were widows in shawls. There were widowers in stiff round hats. There were children who had been left behind by mothers, and mothers who had been left behind by children. There were grandmothers who had lost a daughter and a daughter's daughters in 1 hour of the tide. There were the newly widowed who had been married in the last month of the summer. The vicar of Holy Trinity, old Mr. Boyd, read the service at the first trench. He did not use the printed order of the prayer book alone. He had learned by heart, over many years, the short Latin words that his father had taught him, and he spoke them softly at each grave, though he was a good Church of England man, and though there was no one there to hear them but the wind. He said afterwards that he did not know why he had done it, only that it had seemed to him the honest thing. He read the service 7 times upon the 5th day, and 9 times upon the 7th, and 11 times upon the 9th. He grew hoarse. He grew tired. He did not stop. When at last the 4th trench was closed on the 14th of September, he went home to his small house by the church, and slept for 18 hours without moving, and his housekeeper drew the curtain across the window and would not let anyone in. The mansion house in the city had opened a subscription for the bereaved on the very first day. The Lord Mayor himself, a man named Sir Charles Wetham, had put down £100 of his own. Within a week, the fund had grown to £20,000. It came in small pennies from the working streets and in large notes from the counting houses along Lombard Street. A gasfitter at Silvertown gave a shilling from his week's wages. A dowager in Belgrave Square gave £500. A schoolroom of children in Manchester, who had heard the news read aloud at their morning bench, collected among themselves 7 shillings and 3pence, and sent it down to London in an envelope with a small, careful note. The fund was set aside for the widows and the orphans. It would run for many years. Some of the small pensions it paid were still being drawn in the year 1901, when the old Queen died. The inquest at the town hall ran through the whole of the autumn. The coroner, Mr. Cartar, sat 6 days of the week. He heard 400 witnesses in all. He was patient with the frightened. He was firm with the evasive. He wept once, only, on a day when the mother of the 3 little sisters in white frocks was called to give her small, quiet evidence, and he did not conceal it. On the 14th of November, the jury returned their verdict. They found that the Princess Alice had come into collision with the Bywell Castle through the collier's not slackening her speed and not reversing her engine in time. They found also that the number of lifeboats aboard the Princess Alice had been insufficient, and that the licensing of pleasure steamers upon the river should be reviewed. The Board of Trade, in its separate inquiry, took a different view. It laid the greater blame upon the Princess Alice for her turning across the collier's bow. The 2 findings could not be reconciled, and to this day they are not, though the older watermen of the Reach have always held that both boats had done wrong together, and that the true fault lay with a river grown too crowded for its ancient rules. Changes were made. A new Thames Conservancy Act was drawn up. New rules were set for the meeting of steamers in the Reach below London Bridge. Every passenger boat upon the river was required, from the year following, to carry lifebelts equal to the number of her licensed souls, and to carry boats sufficient for the taking off of at least 1/3 of them. The great outfalls at Barking and at Crossness, which had poured their black tide upon the drowning that night, were ordered to be moved further down the river, so that no city might again choke upon its own refuse in an hour of need. The London Steamboat Company, which had owned the Princess Alice, would never recover from the loss. It struggled on for some years, and then it was sold, and then it was broken up, and its name was heard no more upon the Reach. The Bywell Castle sailed from Millwall on the very next tide. She went down to the sea. She carried her cargo of coal to Alexandria, and she returned, and she sailed again for the North Country, and she was seen upon the river a few times more, and each time the watermen took off their caps as she passed. In the year 1883 she was lost with all hands in the Bay of Biscay on a voyage from Alexandria to Hull, and no piece of her was ever found. The men of the trade said, when the news came, that the river had reached out for her at last. Captain Harrison went back to Newcastle, and he did not command a ship again. He lived for many years in a small house in Tynemouth, and he walked upon the beach in the afternoons, and he did not speak of the Thames. Pilot Dix returned to his cottage at Blackwall. He surrendered his certificate to the Trinity House within the month. He lived 7 years more. His neighbours said that he grew grey very quickly after that September night, and that he could not bear the sound of a steamer's whistle upon the reach, and that he went out only in the early mornings when the river lay quiet. John Ayres, the helmsman, would work upon the river for the rest of his life. He never went aboard a pleasure steamer again. He took a place as helmsman upon a barge in the coal trade, and he was seen upon the reach almost every day for another 30 years, standing quietly at his tiller with a short pipe in his mouth, watching the water pass. He would say only, when asked, that Captain Grinstead had been a good man, and that he had done his best. The engineer Long, the Welshman who had been carried up alive from the flooded Stokehold, went home to a small village in Glamorganshire. He worked in a colliery for the rest of his years. He did not speak of the river. His daughter, who was born to him in the year 1880, said in her old age that her father had never once bathed in the sea, though they had lived within sight of it for all her childhood, and that when a storm came in from the west and the rain beat upon the roof, he would sit very still by the fire and hold her mother's hand and say nothing until it had passed. The public raised its own memorial at the cemetery. A tall pale cross of Cornish granite was ordered from a mason in London and set upon a plinth at the head of the great trench along the western wall. It was paid for by a subscription of pennies. The children of the London board schools gave many of them. The workmen of the arsenal gave the rest. The cross was raised on a Sunday afternoon in the summer of the year 1880, and old Mr. Boyd came up to bless it, and a great crowd stood in the field, and the wind blew softly across the marshes, and the bells of Woolwich rang once more, the passing bell, one clear stroke for each 100 of the lost. The cross bore no names. There were too many. It bore only the words, "In memory of the 650 persons who lost their lives in the wreck of the Princess Alice," and beneath that, the words, "By the voluntary contributions of the sympathising public." The names went into the parish books. They went into the great blue registers of the coroner. They went into the ledger of the wharf-master Roberts, which was later placed in the archive of Trinity House, where it lies still. Some of the small details set down that night are still legible upon its pages. Number 1, female, aged about 30, dark hair, wedding ring, no other mark. Number 2, female, aged about 7, white frock, black boots. Roberts himself lived on for another 11 years. He returned to his ordinary duties at the Arsenal Pier, but it was said of him by the men who worked under him that he was never seen to laugh again. The river returned to its work. The paddle steamers went on running from Swan Pier down to Rosherville and Gravesend and Sheerness through the seasons that followed, though the crowds upon their decks grew thinner and the fare came down, and the season closed earlier every autumn. The bells of the tug still rang in the pool. The tall ships still came up on the flood. The great outfalls at Barking and at Crossness were moved at last, further down the reach toward the sea, and the tide of the city ran a little cleaner. The gulls came in from the estuary and cried above the reach as they had always cried. The stars still rose above the marshes. Rosherville Gardens went on for another 20 years. The roses still bloomed upon the terraces. The fountain still played in the Italian garden. The band still played in the pavilion on summer afternoons. But the crowds grew smaller each season. The excursion trade fell away. The steamers stopped coming down the reach as often as they had. In the year 1899, the gates of the gardens were closed for the last time, and the arch of iron was taken down, and the motto that had promised a happy day was carried away to a scrapyard in Gravesend, and the terraces went slowly back to grass, and the roses returned to the wild rose from which they had come. The 3 sisters in white frocks were buried together in one grave. The Sunday school teachers from Wapping were buried together with their 20 children in a long row. The newly married couple were buried in one coffin, as the coroner had ordered, and their names were cut upon a small stone that their families set at the head of the plot in the following spring. The old grandmother in the black shawl was never found. Her son placed a small brass plate upon the family stone at Bunhill Fields with only her name upon it, and the date, and the words, "Lost in the Thames." The mother of the three sisters, who had gone down with her youngest still in her arms, was carried to the same grave. The dressmaker from Holborn was buried with Emily and Jane, and Sarah, who had lived, laid a small posy of roses upon the trench each year for the rest of her life, until she herself was buried, in another parish, in the year 1929. And the river ran on. It ran through the years and through the seasons. It ran through the last of the pleasure steamers, and through the coming of the electric trams and the motor cars and the great wars. It ran past the arsenal, which grew and grew, and then, in its own long, slow time, was closed and pulled down. It ran past the trenches in Woolwich Old Cemetery, which grew green with grass and were forgotten by all but a few. It ran past the pale granite cross, which still stands, above the western wall, though the letters upon it have grown faint with a century and a half of the rain. It ran, and runs still, past Tripcock Point, where the reeds bend in the wind, and the black beacon on its post gives a small, quiet light against the dark. The candle burned low. The chamber fell silent. The tide, once again, turned in the reach. And history, as it always must, laid down its pen and closed the book upon the 650 souls of the Princess Alice, and let the river carry them, at last, into the peace of the great sea.